Hey guys, tonight we're taking you inside a medical appointment so misguided, so gloriously unhygienic, you'll wonder how anyone made it out of the Middle Ages with both arms still attached. We're not talking about white coats, clipboards and sterile exam rooms. No, tonight's story is about what it was really like to get sick in the 14th century. If you're enjoying our sleepy little plagues and potions, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes, and breathe in the sweet aroma of burning herbs and damp wool. Because tonight, you're not just falling asleep, you're being medically treated. Your symptoms began simply enough. A little fatigue, maybe a slight chill in your bones. Nothing you'd normally worry about. But it's the year 1349, and you've just made the fatal mistake of looking unwell within sniffing distance of a monk. Now you're horizontal on a straw mattress, your feet wrapped in vinegar-soaked rags, and someone's hovering nearby with a very large jar labelled phlegm. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval medicine, where the first step to healing is guessing, and the second step is bleeding. Before you even feel properly sick, a diagnosis is declared based on the sacred principles of humoral theory, a concept blessed by ancient Greek authority and preserved in European medical tradition with all the fervour of a half-remembered spell. The idea? Your body is made up of 4 squishy invisible fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. If any of these are out of whack, congratulations. You've got a full-blown illness, a spiritual crisis, or perhaps the devil trying to escape through your toes. The solution? Rebalance those humours, usually by draining them. A physician is summoned, not because you can afford one, but because your neighbour saw a mole on your back shaped vaguely like Saturn, and that was enough to panic the village. He arrives in a long robe stitched with grease stains and possibly divine inspiration. He's holding a book written in Latin, a small glass flask, and a sense of absolute certainty that your spleen is too moist. Before asking your name, he asks for your urine, not metaphorically, literally. You're handed a flask, escorted behind a bush, and instructed to produce something diagnostically interesting. The result is then lifted up to the light, compared to a painted parchment wheel with 21 shades of yellow, sniffed like a sommelier testing vintage mead, and proclaimed to be abnormally warm and frothy. A diagnosis, it seems, has been reached. The culprit? An excess of blood, or possibly bile, or you were born under the wrong moon. It doesn't really matter, you'll be bled anyway. You see, medieval medicine isn't about targeting disease, it's about restoring balance, feeling feverish, too much blood, feeling slow and sluggish. That's phlegm taking the wheel. Are you weeping uncontrollably for no reason? That's black bile, obviously, and possibly divine punishment for letting your thoughts wander during Mass. Galen, a Roman physician born in 129 CE, wrote the book on it, literally. His teachings were preserved, copied, embellished, and passed down through generations, eventually becoming the foundation of European medical education. Never mind that Galen based most of his ideas on dissected pigs and gladiator injuries. If he said your liver was a radiator for the soul, well, no one was going to argue, especially not the medical universities of Salerno and Montpellier, which churned out freshly robed physicians ready to smell your fluids and rearrange your body temperature using fire, prayer, and occasionally cinnamon. Now, if your condition requires something a little more physical, like removing a boil the size of a pigeon egg, or dealing with that festering cut on your leg, you'll be referred to someone less academic, the barber surgeon. Barber surgeons are a special breed, part hairstylist, part butcher, part battlefield saviour. You might visit them for a trim and leave with fewer fingers than you arrived with. They're easy to spot. Look for the red and white pole outside their stall, which isn't just decorative. It's symbolic of the blood and bandage tradition they quite literally spun into history. They don't quote Aristotle, they don't bother with astrology, but they do own a bone saw and a sturdy apron. In all likelihood, you'll spend some time in a hospital. Not the good kind, though. The monastic kind. A drafty, lice-filled hall where your spiritual well-being is a higher priority than your pulse. Hospitals in the 14th century Europe are often run by religious orders with a focus on soul-cleansing prayer, feeding the poor, and laying out clean straw for the dying. Windows are optional, beds are shared, and the scent of damp wool and holy water hangs in the air like a warning. You're not there to get better. You're there to get right with God before the inevitable. Every step of your medical journey is soaked in theology and guesswork. Physicians might carry star charts to determine which of your organs is ruled by Mars, and whether today is an auspicious day to drain your fluids. The Zodiac Man, a naked diagram beloved by medieval textbooks, shows you exactly which body part corresponds to which celestial body, and why, for example, you must never treat the liver while the moon is waxing. Still feel unwell? No problem. You'll be offered a hot poultice made from mouldy bread, wine, goose fat, or whatever else is within arm's reach. If that fails, there's always trepanation. The process of drilling a small hole in your skull to release bad spirits, evil vapours, or, as some believed, inconvenient thoughts. The horrifying part is this: they meant well. For all the pain, confusion and misplaced toads, medieval medicine wasn't designed to harm. It was an honest, if terrifying, attempt to understand the human body. The physicians and barbers and monks weren't malicious. They were simply working with the best ideas they had, and a deep, almost poetic misunderstanding of anatomy. They didn't know about germs. They didn't have microscopes. They thought pus was a sign of healing, and that dreams could diagnose disease. Their world was built on manuscripts, tradition, and divine mystery. And their patients, like you, trusted in the process because there were no better options. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift back through the centuries, try to imagine it. The scratchy linen beneath you, the taste of mint steeped in sour wine, the flickering torchlight casting shadows over a wall of bloodletting charts. A doctor quietly muttering something about your kidneys being too cold for spring, and a leech inching its way toward your inner thigh with unsettling confidence. You're not in danger, you're in treatment. Your eyes flutter open just as a monk finishes reciting a healing psalm over your face. You've slept miraculously through the night. The fever hasn't worsened, but that doesn't mean you're out of danger. In fact, you've just reached stage 2 of your treatment. It's time for the bleeding, not metaphorical bleeding, not gentle therapy or herbal steam baths. We're talking actual veins opened by actual blades, ideally before breakfast. This morning's physician, bless him, is already consulting his bleeding chart. It's a colourful wheel of nonsense that tells him when and where to bleed you, depending on the date, your complaint, and your unfortunate astrological alignment. According to this particular chart, today is a good day to relieve you of excess blood from the left forearm, because the moon is waning in Pisces, and your liver has been looking emotionally unstable. And so, the ritual begins. Bloodletting was not a fringe treatment, it was the standard, a pillar of Galenic medicine, practiced across the Islamic world, Christian Europe, and even parts of Asia for centuries. The logic was painfully simple. If the body is out of balance, just drain the extra. Too much blood? Cut. Too much heat? Bleed it out? Too many dreams about frogs? That'll be 3 leeches and a lancet. You're seated upright, arm extended, and a small fire is lit beside you. Not for warmth, but for sterilizing the tools. In theory. In reality, it's mostly for ambience. There is no anesthesia, just wine, and not enough of it. The physician selects a shiny, slightly rusted lancet, a short, sharp blade designed to pierce your vein like a speared sausage casing. Some physicians preferred the scalpel. Others opted for glass cups heated over flame and pressed against the skin to draw blood through suction, a process called cupping that leaves you looking like a well-beaten drum. And then there are the leeches. Ah, the leech, nature's most squishy and least reassuring surgeon, kept in little clay pots by monks and medical students. These thumb-sized parasites were prized for their gentle touch and even gentler bloodthirst. Leeches were applied to delicate areas, the eyelids, gums, behind the ears, or anywhere a blade might seem excessive. The process took longer than a lancet, but many preferred it, probably because the leeches didn't shout at you in Latin while draining your life away. Monasteries, particularly in France and England, became breeding grounds, literally, for leeches. Monks raised them in jars and ponds, carefully monitored their blood-drinking schedules, and occasionally fasted the leeches between patients to keep them hungry. There are records of leech breeding logs being kept more diligently than patient records. It's estimated that medieval Europe went through millions of leeches a year. One English hospital alone recorded using over 20,000 in a single season. You, dear listener, are about to meet 4 of them, enthusiastically applied to your neck while the physician murmurs something about your overactive spleen. There was also a certain performative element to all this. Doctors were expected to bleed patients with style. They wore fine robes and gestured dramatically. They would even present the drained blood to your family afterward, proudly displaying the corrupted humour in a bowl as if they'd summoned it from the underworld. You're lightheaded, pale, and mildly suspicious that the blood loss is causing more problems than it's solving. But this is where medicine stood for centuries. No one questioned it. And if someone did survive, well, it must have worked. In fact, bloodletting was prescribed for almost anything. Acne, nosebleeds, gout, indigestion, broken hearts, prophetic dreams, and the occasional case of demonic possession. For a surprising number of those, leeches were involved. Even monks, often the main healthcare providers in rural areas, specialised in bloodletting, especially during Lent. Ironically, it was one of the few medical tasks they were allowed to perform, since it was considered more of a spiritual cleansing than an invasive procedure. In some abbeys, there were set days each month when all the brothers would be bled, as a kind of ecclesiastical oil change. But here's the thing. Medieval doctors didn't just bleed patients anywhere or any time. The location on the body and the timing of the procedure were both dictated by cosmic forces. You couldn't bleed the head during Aries season. That was asking for trouble. The liver was governed by Sagittarius, the knees by Capricorn, and you definitely didn't want to interfere with the lungs during Mercury's retrograde, or risk coughing up more than just phlegm. Bleeding charts were gorgeously illustrated manuscripts that mapped veins to star signs, as if the body were a walking horoscope. These were copied and shared in universities, monasteries, and among the upper classes. A good physician didn't just cut, he consulted the heavens first. Medieval malpractice often boiled down to, did you consider Mars before opening the ankle vein? Back in your room, your physician decides you've had enough for now. You've lost roughly half a pint, maybe more. The bowl looks festive. The leeches are full and sleepy. Your pulse is irregular but still present. Victory. To prevent infection, a word no one actually uses yet, a mixture of wine, crushed garlic, and maybe some honey is dabbed on the wound. You're told to rest. You're also told that your blood has too much heat, and that to prevent a recurrence of symptoms you should avoid spicy foods, angry thoughts, and possibly music in a minor key. So you lie there, woozy and slightly drained in every sense, trying not to move your bandaged arm while wondering how bloodletting hasn't killed more people. But here's the secret. It has. And that brings us to the next chapter of your medieval recovery. Diagnosis by urine. Because if the bleeding didn't solve it, the colour of your pee absolutely will. You've barely recovered from the bloodletting. If recovering means drifting in and out of consciousness while clutching your arm like it personally betrayed you. When your physician returns with a new instrument of terror, a flask, glass, narrow-necked, warm from his cloak and empty, not for long. Without making eye contact, he places it beside your bed with the reverence of a holy relic and announces that it's time to inspect your waters. You are, he assures you, quite lucky. Diagnosing illness through urine is the most advanced science available in all of Europe, possibly the world, and it involves no bleeding, which is a relief for now. Urine examination, or uroscopy if you want to impress your local barber surgeon, was a cornerstone of medieval diagnostics. More than just a bodily byproduct, your pee was believed to be the distilled essence of your internal condition, a divine message in liquid form, the philosopher's stone of fluids, and so it was tested, prodded, sniffed, shaken, sometimes even tasted, all in the name of healing. Across medieval Europe, no respectable physician travelled without his uroscopy kit. A polished urine flask called a matula, a colour chart, and ideally a portable bench upon which to prop the sample for closer examination under daylight. A medieval version of lab results. It's important to remember that most of these men had never heard of kidneys, bladder function, or even bacteria. They believed the liver cooked the blood and excreted the excess as urine, and that illnesses reveal themselves in the vapours carried from your internal organs into your bladder. It made sense to them. Well, almost. The diagnosis begins with the colour. Your sample is held up to the window. Today's morning light is hazy, filtered through monastery smoke and fog. Not ideal, but passable. The physician consults his urine chart, a gorgeous hand-painted parchment displaying a wheel of 20 different urine shades, each matched with a condition. Is your urine a clear pale straw? You're probably faint of spirit or melancholic. Amber, too much heat in the blood. Cloudy orange, digestive rot. Brownish red, your liver is planning a coup. Blue or green, you're either cursed or already dead. Today your urine is yellow, solidly yellow, not bright, not faint, not glowing, just yellow. This is not comforting. According to the chart, and the sacred teachings of Galen, Avicenna, and that one guy who had a vision involving a sick goat, yellow urine means your body is hot and dry. You have too much bile, possibly both kinds, and your humours are fighting one another in a steamy internal wrestling match. The prescription, possibly a cold poultice, possibly purging, possibly an exorcism. It depends on the bubbles. Yes, bubbles. The physician gently shakes the flask and studies the foam. If the bubbles are large and break quickly, you may be recovering. If they're small and long-lasting, you're in serious trouble. If they form a frothy head like a cheap tavern ale, it's probably too late to say goodbye to your family. Then there's the sediment. Some samples, depending on how long they've been sitting, show flakes or particles that settle at the bottom. These are believed to be remnants of your inner decay. The dregs of your personality, perhaps. Does your sample have sediment? It does. He frowns. Then, with an unsettling level of commitment, the physician opens the flask, brings it to his nose and inhales. To the medieval mind, smell was deeply diagnostic. Sweet-smelling urine could indicate spiritual illness, or excessive sugar, though they didn't know it was diabetes. Sour smells meant inflammation. Pungent, sulfuric aromas. Rot. Internal fire. Possibly demons again. One physician famously catalogued over 36 distinct urine odours, from baked apple to swamp goat. Another claimed he could diagnose the exact location of a tumour by how far the scent travelled across the room. You can't help but wonder if any of this was real, or if these men were just incredibly bored and disturbingly curious. As the physician lowers the flask, he nods thoughtfully. Warm, yellow, slightly foamy, minor sediment, a tang of roasted chestnut. You blink. He's smiling. Apparently this is good. Then he writes the word melancholia in his ledger again, which is mildly concerning since he already used that diagnosis yesterday. Either your liver has darkened further, or he simply likes the way it sounds. If you had any social standing, say you were a noble or someone who could afford embroidered underpants, this whole scene might have happened without your presence at all. Wealthier patients often sent their urine flasks ahead of them to the doctor, who would examine the sample remotely and send back a written diagnosis. No house calls, no physical exams, just a courier carrying a bottle of warm pee through the countryside like it was a love letter from your kidneys. This led to one of the more bizarre developments in medieval medicine: professional uromancers. These were men, sometimes women, who specialised only in interpreting urine. They travelled with sample kits, urine charts, astrological calendars, and a profound sense of confidence. They never touched the patient, just the sample. They would diagnose, prescribe, and sometimes pray over the flask before returning it to the owner, infused with divine insight and the occasional wine stain. It wasn't cheap, but it was trendy. You're jolted back to reality as the physician corks the bottle and hands it to an assistant, who carries it reverently to a wooden cabinet, where it will sit next to 12 other samples from 12 other unfortunate souls, all labelled with confusing symbols and someone's guess at the current moon phase. You ask weakly, what happens next? The physician leans in, lowers his voice like he's revealing state secrets, and whispers, "Now we check your tongue." You don't know whether to laugh or cry, but your bowels gurgle ominously, as if preparing for their own subplot. By now, the urine has been sealed, the verdict issued, and the chart consulted. But the examination is not over. Not in a world where the body is believed to be a mystical stew of fluids, stars, and divine whispers. In more advanced diagnostic circles, physicians weren't satisfied with merely looking at urine. They also tasted it. Yes, tasted. While not common among low-ranking surgeons or travelling healers, the more scholarly physicians, those educated at Salerno or Montpellier, were known to sample the edge of their matula with a cautious sip, searching for signs of sweetness, acidity, or bitterness. A sugary taste often pointed to what would now be understood as diabetes, though it was described more vaguely as a honeyed humour or boiling of the blood. Bitterness could signal bile imbalances or liver issues. Metallic tang was chalked up to iron spirits, a term which helpfully meant nothing and everything. The belief was that the soul and humours manifested themselves in bodily fluids, and that one could taste imbalance, literally, with proper training and the stomach for it. This was referred to as sapientia gustus, or the wisdom of taste, and was recorded in several university texts as a valid step in medical examination. While most modern historians suspect the practice was more rare than the manuscripts imply, it still holds the honour of being one of the most revolting footnotes in European medical history. The role of astrology in urine diagnosis added another surreal layer. Planetary theory governed nearly every aspect of the medieval body. The sun, moon, and 5 known planets each ruled over certain organs and humours. A physician might interpret a yellow foamy urine sample, not just in terms of heat or bile, but in conjunction with Mercury's position in the night sky. If Venus was in opposition, it could mean the problem wasn't in the liver at all, but in the kidneys or reproductive organs, even if the urine said otherwise. This practice was codified in texts like the Liber Urinarum, widely distributed in manuscript form across Europe. The book didn't just list what colour meant what, it also told practitioners which zodiac signs ruled which body parts, and how lunar eclipses might affect the fluidity of a patient's sample. Urine was not just a medical fluid, it was a celestial messenger, an oracle in a bottle. Charts of zodiac men showed human figures overlaid with astrological symbols, detailing how each part of the body corresponded to the stars. In theory, this helped doctors plan procedures. In practice, It made the diagnostic process a strange fusion of fortune-telling and fluid inspection, a urine horoscope with life or death consequences. Urine was also a key tool for identifying divine punishment and demonic interference. If a sample appeared green, black, or overly viscous, some healers would determine that the soul itself was under attack. Thick waters were seen as evidence of melancholy, spiritual corruption, or an imbalance of the soul's natural light. Some monasteries kept records of patients whose urine smelled of brimstone and was accompanied by shaking or hallucinations. These individuals were often bled repeatedly, prayed over, or, in more rural areas, physically beaten in the hopes of expelling the evil. Some believed that demons could spoil a person's waters to confuse physicians. Others thought that the devil's presence would cause the urine to not appear at all. In this case, a dry bladder meant not hydration issues but spiritual possession. There are accounts of nuns using herbs like wormwood and fennel to purify the waters, often administered alongside psalms. Some of these same herbs had diuretic effects, creating a medical ritual that appeared to confirm its own effectiveness. A neat feedback loop of superstition and biology. Urine was even used for virginity testing, particularly among the nobility. Recipes and manuscripts claim that a virgin's urine, when mixed with wine and heated, would produce a distinct scent or reaction, a practice entirely unsupported by science, but enthusiastically embraced by anxious fathers, overpaid healers, and church officials. In other cases, physicians would burn dried urine samples to observe the vapour. Sweet-smelling smoke meant health. Foul smoke meant corruption. No smoke meant, depending on the region, either divine intervention or that someone forgot to clean the chamber pot. This burning method, often done in small ceramic dishes, was sometimes used to detect the presence of plague. During outbreaks, physicians claimed that the smell of burned plague urine was sharp, bitter, and thick. While there's no evidence they could reliably distinguish plague this way, the effort shows how central urine was to every part of the diagnostic process, from fever to death. Beyond the elite physicians and university-trained experts, folk healers and wise women developed their own interpretations of urine. In Slavic and Nordic traditions, urine was poured over sacred stones or left overnight under moonlight to attract spirits or reveal omens. The way it evaporated, the animals it attracted, or the dreams that followed were believed to hold healing clues. Some healers mixed urine with ashes or clay to read patterns, much like a mystic would read tea leaves. In the Islamic world, which maintained and translated many Greek and Roman medical texts, urine analysis was equally central, but approached with more methodical reasoning. Physicians like Avicenna refined Galenic methods with their own observations, and developed urine charts that travelled back to Europe during the Crusades and through Moorish Spain, heavily influencing Christian medical practice. All this reverence for urine meant that presentation mattered. Urine flasks were often made of blown glass, shaped to fit comfortably in the hand and narrow enough at the top to focus scent. Wealthy physicians had personalised flasks. Poorer ones reused them. Some even painted markings on the outside to indicate normal sediment levels or help compare two samples side by side. Physicians kept ledgers with notes about each patient's sample, including date, colour, consistency, scent, bubble pattern, and planetary conditions. Over time, these became early versions of case histories, sometimes adorned with decorative initials and miniature illustrations of diseased organs imagined entirely from guesswork and artistic license. By the 15th century, uroscopy fell out of favour in elite medical circles, particularly as Renaissance thinkers began poking holes in Galenic logic and pressing for more empirical observation. But among rural healers and village doctors, urine remained the diagnostic tool of choice for centuries longer. Even into the 17th century, patients were still sending flasks to town doctors, hoping for insight and a recipe for nettle tea or dried beetle powder. The urine wheel, brightly illustrated and helpfully circular, continued to appear in printed medical almanacs well into the age of microscopes. Today, those same wheels are studied by historians not just for their misguided medical content, but for what they reveal about how humans tried to understand the mysteries of the body, how they turned every drop into data, every scent into symbolism, every bottle into a prayer. And so the urine bottle is sealed, the diagnosis is logged, your bile is still very much in charge, but at least now it's documented. You've been bled, you've been sniffed, you've been labelled hot and dry and possibly unlucky, and now it's time for the next step in your medieval care plan. Your headache, the one pulsing behind your eye and inching toward your temple, is beginning to concern the staff. And there's only one reasonable solution. They're going to burn it out of you. The urine has been bottled, the blood has been spilled, and your humours, according to a man with a bird feather quill and a suspicious lack of teeth, are on the mend. But there's one small issue left. Your head is pounding. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, not as an omen of demonic invasion, just a full, throbbing, miserable headache. The kind brought on by dehydration, fever, and perhaps the repeated trauma of having your fluids interpreted like an astrological forecast. In the modern world, this would earn you a glass of water, a quiet room, maybe a nap. In 14th century Europe, it earns you a hot iron. The medieval understanding of headaches was, like most things at the time, both deeply sincere and wildly wrong. Head pain could be attributed to any number of things: imbalance of humours, an excess of blood in the head, spiritual unrest, exposure to bad air, lunar influence, constipation, or sometimes a particularly sharp wind to the temple. Whatever the suspected cause, the goal was always the same: remove the offending force, and if draining your arm didn't work, maybe it was time to open your skull. Enter cauterization, the act of deliberately burning the flesh to restore bodily harmony. It sounds brutal. It was. But in the Middle Ages, fire was believed to hold curative power. Heat could rebalance humours, expel toxins, even calm the nervous system. And for head pain, there was no better place to apply that fire than directly to your scalp. Cauterization was used for everything from infected wounds to dislocated joints. It was especially beloved for stopping bleeding and sealing off corruption. Monks practiced it in monastic hospitals. Barber surgeons used it in battlefields. University-trained doctors ordered it with cool detachment. The tools were simple: metal rods, shaped like spears or spatulas, heated in open flame until glowing red. Some were flat. Others had notched edges or hooks for more specialised procedures. When applied to the skin, the hot iron did exactly what you'd expect: burned straight through. The pain was unimaginable, the stench unforgettable, and the results often inconclusive, but it looked decisive, and that mattered. If your pain was believed to be caused by excessive blood in the head, cauterization might be combined with scarification, slicing the scalp in shallow lines and applying fire afterward. The idea was to draw out noxious vapour or relieve pressure. Some physicians also smeared medicinal pastes made of crushed herbs and vinegar on the wound post-burn, claiming it helped balance heat with moisture. Cauterization wasn't just used for headaches. It was also a go-to treatment for everything from epilepsy to persistent sadness. There are medieval records of patients being burned on the neck to restore clarity of thought, on the spine for nervous trembling, and on the limbs for paralysis. In particularly optimistic cases, it was used to treat blindness, the theory being that if you burn the back of the head hard enough, the front might start working again. Of course, very little of this was based on anatomical understanding. Most doctors had never seen a brain, much less understood its function. What they had was a blend of Galenic logic, Christian mysticism, battlefield improvisation, and centuries of guesswork dressed up in Latin. For more extreme head conditions, migraines, chronic pain, seizures, or visible trauma, the ultimate procedure was trepanation, the act of drilling a hole directly into your skull. Trepanation was not invented in medieval Europe. It dates back thousands of years, with evidence of the practice found in Neolithic remains across Africa, South America, and Eastern Europe. But in the medieval period, it took on a new kind of spiritual medical hybrid logic. To the medieval practitioner, the skull was a container for humours, spirits, and possibly sinful thoughts. A build-up of pressure inside could cause madness, seizures, or death. Opening a small hole was a way of relieving that pressure, draining the foul vapour, or even giving a passage for demonic forces to escape. Trepanation tools range from primitive hand drills to specialised traphenes, circular saws with handles, often tipped with spikes to anchor into bone. The procedure was sometimes done with the patient fully conscious, held down by assistants and given wine or opium if available. In battlefield settings, trepanation was also used to relieve skull fractures. Soldiers who had suffered blunt trauma might receive the procedure in an effort to remove bone fragments or prevent brain fever. There were even reports of soldiers surviving the operation and returning to combat, a miracle often cited as proof of its efficacy, not of their sheer luck and thick skulls. To the layperson, trepanation must have seemed terrifying, a procedure both brutal and eerily precise. But to the medieval mind, it was part of a broader belief system, that the body could be vented like a forge, releasing imbalance, illness, and spiritual disorder through deliberate trauma. Diagrams from the 14th century surgical manuals show the entire process in vivid detail. The patient sitting upright, a semicircle shaved from the scalp, the trepan positioned like a corkscrew. These illustrations weren't meant to horrify. They were instructional, passed from teacher to student, copied by hand, and regarded with academic pride. The most famous of these images was the Wound Man. The Wound Man was a staple of late medieval medical manuscripts, a single figure, usually naked, depicted with every conceivable injury: cuts, burns, broken bones, arrows, animal bites, and surgical wounds, including several trepanation scars. The image was less a literal portrait and more a visual index, a way of saying, here is everything that can go wrong and how we might fix it. Alongside the figure were labels, in Latin or Middle French, describing treatments, cauterization points, and prayer suggestions. The Wound Man became a kind of medieval medical mascot. He appeared in books from Germany to Italy, evolving with each generation. Some versions included astrological symbols or references to saints. Others showed him triumphantly surviving his injuries, arms spread like a bloody Renaissance Vitruvian man. For the patient, though, being treated like the Wound Man was less inspiring. It meant being burned, cut, or drilled based on the best guesses of men who thought sneezing too often could kill you. Despite its horrors, trepanation occasionally worked, at least in the sense that some people lived. This was enough to cement it in the medieval medical repertoire. If a patient survived, the surgeon gained prestige. If they died, it was assumed the illness was too far gone, or that God had other plans. Cauterization was similarly self-justifying. A wound that healed confirmed the wisdom of the burn. A wound that festered confirmed the severity of the illness. Either way, the doctor retained his authority, and the patient rarely lived long enough to dispute it. Notably, the church had a complex relationship with trepanation and cautery. On one hand, monks were forbidden to shed blood. On the other, they were some of the most skilled medical practitioners of the time. In many monastic infirmaries, hot iron was permitted as a non-bleeding intervention, a loophole that allowed monks to participate in advanced surgery while technically keeping their vows intact. In cases of suspected demonic possession, trepanation could be accompanied by spiritual ritual. Holy water, relics, and prayer were applied in tandem with the drill. If a patient seized or screamed during the procedure, it was taken as confirmation that the demon had been disturbed. If the patient died, the demon was likely very powerful, or the physician's Latin was a little rusty. Today these practices seem barbaric, and they were in many ways. But they were also earnest. Medieval physicians didn't set out to torture. They set out to treat, using the tools and knowledge they had. And in a time without antibiotics, anesthesia, or basic understanding of infection, fire and iron seemed logical solutions. After all, the logic was consistent. If your body was out of balance, heat could restore it. If your brain was under pressure, open the lid. If your spirit was troubled, make a hole for it to leave. Simple, director, horrifying. And so the iron is cooled. The trepan is returned to its case. Your headache has subsided, either from the distraction of physical trauma or the large quantity of wine someone shoved into your mouth mid-procedure. Your scalp has been shaved. Your soul, presumably, has been realigned. You've now survived bloodletting, urine inspection, and direct thermal violence to the head, which means you're ready for the next step in your medieval care plan. It's time to take a closer look at what's coming out of your mouth, and that brings us, gently, to your next phase of healing. Saliva, leeches, lice, and the mystery of medieval mucus. You've survived the hot iron. A portion of your scalp is now bald, your skull may be slightly aerated, and your humours have been charred into submission, for now. But the physician is not satisfied. The head has been drained, the urine inspected, the blood very much exited. Yet your breathing is shallow, your colour pale. There's something lingering in the chest, and that means it's time for the next diagnostic adventure in your medieval treatment plan. A thorough inspection of your spit. That's right. Saliva, phlegm, mucus, sputum, the frothy soup of your mouth and throat. To the modern world, it's a bodily nuisance, a byproduct of illness. To the 14th century medical mind, it's a window into your soul. Spitting was not merely a bad habit in medieval Europe. It was a diagnostic event. Physicians, monks, and lay healers across the continent believed that the consistency, colour, and odour of your mouth slime could reveal everything from the state of your lungs to the moral decay of your spirit. This practice, known as sputum analysis, was especially important when dealing with persistent coughs, chest tightness, or wet fevers, which were thought to arise when phlegm overwhelmed the blood. The assumption was that by observing what you expelled, doctors could observe the inner battles raging within you. Naturally, no one wore gloves. The process began with a sample. You'd be handed a bowl or cupped dish, often reused, sometimes wooden, occasionally still sticky from the last patient. You were expected to hock up whatever you could manage. A respectable sputum session produced enough fluid for observation. The more phlegm you could summon, the more data your doctor had to work with. The sputum was examined immediately. The doctor, or often an assistant monk, would hold it up to the light and begin his analysis. Colour was critical. Clear and watery meant an imbalance of cold phlegm, associated with lethargy and chill. Thick and yellow, that indicated a hot inflammation of the chest, likely requiring bloodletting or burning. Green was worse, a sign of putrefaction. Black was considered nearly fatal, and red, especially when mixed with bubbles, was diagnosed as consumption, a term used broadly to describe diseases now known as tuberculosis and advanced respiratory infections. Texture was also evaluated. Was the mucus stringy, lumpy, gelatinous? Could it be drawn into threads between two fingers? The more dramatic the consistency, the more likely you were to be labelled phlegmatic, which was not just a mood, it was a full-blown diagnosis. odour was noted but rarely recorded. Most physicians agreed that foul-smelling spit meant something was rotting inside you. Whether it was your lungs, your stomach, or your soul depended on the physician's personal preferences and planetary charts. Sputum analysis was especially popular in monastic hospitals, where monks routinely cared for the sick and dying. In many cases, patients were brought to the infirmary not because of fevers or wounds, but because they were coughing persistently or had difficulty breathing. These symptoms were taken seriously, not necessarily because they could spread, but because they were believed to reflect deep spiritual disorder. Coughing up blood was not just alarming, it was theological. Some monks saw it as a sign of internal penance, that your body was purging sin. Others interpreted it as divine punishment. Either way, the spit was examined and sometimes prayed over. In more rural abbeys, there are records of sputum being blessed before being discarded, as if to ensure the sickness it carried would not re-enter the community through careless disposal. Alongside sputum came the most medieval of medical accessories, the louse. Lice in the Middle Ages were not just common, they were expected. Most people lived with them, combed them, picked them, shared them. Entire social rituals developed around delousing, particularly among families and cloistered religious communities. It was a routine act of hygiene, intimacy, and in some cases diagnosis. Medical texts from the period describe lice and nits, their eggs, as symptoms of excessive moisture and poor digestion, signs that the body was failing to regulate its internal temperature or excrete its excess humours properly. A patient overrun with lice might be deemed moist of head or stagnant of liver. Sometimes they were bled, sometimes purged. In rarer cases, the lice were welcomed as natural healers, believed to draw out illness by feeding on bad blood. One 13th century French herbal suggests that the sudden appearance of lice on an otherwise clean individual could mean a humoral explosion was imminent. It recommended immediate rest, cold compresses, and abstention from lustful thought. This last point was curiously common across many unrelated medical recipes. If your lice problem became overwhelming, or if your coughing turned more productive than poetic, you might find yourself prescribed one of the most luxurious and horrifying medieval treatments, leeches, to the throat. Unlike their earlier appearance in arm vein therapy, leeches applied near the jawline or neck were believed to help with chest congestion and throat inflammation. They were placed under the chin, behind the ears, or even along the temples, and left to feast. Some sources claim they were used to reduce swelling in cases of quinsy, a painful throat abscess often fatal without drainage. Others suggest leeches were used to treat chronic coughs by relieving pressure from the jugular veins. As with all leech therapies, the logic was simple. If the body was full of bad fluid, something had to suck it out. Saliva itself had a complicated symbolic status. It was both sacred and profane, associated with healing, cursing, and everything in between. In Christian lore, spittle had divine associations. Christ is said to have used his own spit to heal the blind. Saints and mystics mimicked this by blessing water with saliva or making crosses on ailing foreheads with spit-soaked fingers. But outside of sacred ritual, saliva was feared. Uncontrolled spitting, drooling, or excessive mucus was seen as a mark of madness, demonic influence, or loss of soul moisture. In one particularly strange 14th century manuscript, a healer claims he can determine whether a person is afflicted with sorrow of the spleen by placing a drop of their saliva onto a hot stone and watching the way it sizzles. Fast evaporation meant sorrow. Slow evaporation meant grief. If it didn't evaporate at all, the person was likely cursed and possibly contagious. Sputum also played a surprising role in romantic and social diagnosis. There are references to lovesick patients having sweet breath but bitter drool, and to unfaithful spouses being tested by the texture of their spit. A few surviving folk charms even recommend placing saliva under one's pillow to ward off jealous rivals or to dream of future lovers. Meanwhile, in Italy and the Iberian Peninsula, a belief emerged that healthy spit could be used to drive off evil spirits. Mothers would spit on their fingers and rub them on their children's foreheads before sending them to school or work. This was not seen as unhygienic, it was protective. Holy spit, medicinal spit. Truly, the medieval mouth was a medical battlefield. By the late Middle Ages, new texts began to formalise the role of sputum in diagnosis. University libraries in Bologna, Paris and Prague contained charts comparing mucus colours, spit patterns, and corresponding illnesses. These were copied and distributed to both elite physicians and town doctors. But even as these charts gained popularity, they were slowly being replaced by another idea. A radical, dangerous, heretical notion creeping into Europe from dusty Arab libraries and renegade scholars. The idea that maybe, just maybe, spit didn't mean everything. The Renaissance would eventually bury sputum analysis beneath anatomy books and microscopes, but for now it remains gospel. The physician has your bowl, the monks have their chart, and somewhere a louse is making its way across your collarbone in search of better lodging, and so you lie still, saliva measured, mucus examined, insects recorded. You've been bled, trepanned, sniffed, bubbled, and now spit analysed. The next step? Something sharper, because your condition has worsened. Your boils are angry. And the man sharpening the cleaver says the barber surgeon will see you now. Your sputum has been analysed. Your head has been cauterised. Your bodily fluids have been sampled, charted, sniffed, and possibly blessed. And yet, you're still sick. Worse, in fact. There's a boil on your thigh that has begun speaking Latin, or at least making wet, squelching noises that sound like heresy. Your fever is climbing. Your pulse is irregular, and someone has spotted a patch of blackened skin that wasn't there yesterday. It's time to bring in the big guns. No more urine wheels, no more prayer circles, no more physician robes stitched with planetary embroidery. You need someone with a blade, a bandage, and exactly 0 patience for metaphysics. It's time for the barber surgeon. While the term barber surgeon may sound like a Renaissance festival joke, these were real, deeply necessary, and utterly terrifying figures of medieval medicine. They occupied the professional no man's land between healer and handyman, part barber, part butcher, part battlefield miracle worker. And yes, they would happily cut your hair and your leg on the same visit. Discount if you did both. Unlike the robed physicians of Montpellier, who prefer to diagnose from a distance and handle only flasks and parchment, barber surgeons were hands-on. If something needed to be drained, lanced, stitched, or amputated, they did it. They weren't expected to quote Aristotle or reference astrological charts. Their education came from apprenticeships, guild training, and frequent exposure to other people's insides. In short, if a doctor told you your arm was full of bad blood, the barber surgeon was the one who removed it, preferably with a smile, a steady hand, and a damp apron. The red and white barber pole, still seen outside barbershops today, is a remnant of their dual profession. The red symbolises blood, the white, bandages, and the spiral design, that originated from the practice of patients squeezing a blooded cloth during bleeding to keep the veins bulging, a sort of medieval stress ball soaked in regret. These poles were once hung with actual leeches, drying surgical cloths, or occasionally trophy teeth. So if you were wandering through a medieval town and saw a striped pole outside a stall, you weren't just finding a place for a trim, you were entering a certified pain emporium. You are, of course, not being offered a trim. You're being prepped for boil lancing. This is one of the barber surgeon's most common procedures, just behind tooth pulling and battlefield amputations. Boils, abscesses, and festering wounds were rampant in the Middle Ages, caused by poor hygiene, tight clothing, insect bites, infected cuts, and curses from nearby peasants. These pus-filled lumps were treated as both medical concerns and public spectacles. Lancing a boil was considered therapeutic and slightly theatrical. Crowds sometimes gathered. Apprentices were invited to observe. Lords might watch while sipping wine, nodding as if evaluating a joust. The surgeon would clean the skin, possibly with wine, possibly with water from a stream behind the latrine, then heat a knife over flame. No anesthesia, of course. Just biting a rag, swearing into your sleeve, or fainting before the first cut. Once sliced, the boil would release its treasure: pus, blood, and in particularly dramatic cases, hair, worms, or bits of embedded clothing. The fluid's colour and smell were noted with clinical interest and zero facial expression. Then came the sealing, either with a cloth soaked in wine and honey, a poultice of herbs and clay, or a glowing iron pressed directly onto the wound. This wasn't just to stop bleeding, it was to cauterize the corruption, literally burn away the sin. If your boil had already gone too deep, or your wound was festering beyond repair, then you'd be facing something even more medieval than public pus: amputation. Amputations were relatively common in an age of constant injury, infection, war, and livestock-related accidents. Arms, legs, fingers, toes, anything visibly rotting or inconveniently infected might be removed as a precaution. There were no antibiotics, no knowledge of sterilization, no concern for long-term mobility, just a choice between losing the limb or letting it kill you. The procedure went like this: tie a tight tourniquet above the limb, offer the patient strong wine or a wooden spoon to bite, slice through the flesh quickly with a long curved blade, saw through the bone, cauterize the stump with a red-hot iron or smear it with pitch and linen. If the patient survived the initial trauma and didn't succumb to infection in the days that followed, they were considered a miraculous success story, often celebrated, sometimes paraded around, and occasionally consulted as experts on pain tolerance. The barber surgeon didn't work alone. He had tools, and they were stunningly awful. Fleams, narrow blades for opening veins or lancing boils, bone saws, resembling modern hacksaws but without the charming safety standards, tooth keys, terrifying metal wrenches used to yank teeth by forceful twisting, trepan drills, reused for everything from skull surgery to carpentry, hooks, forceps, probes, and scoops, none of which were ever properly cleaned. These tools were stored in wooden chests or worn on belts, giving the barber surgeon the look of either a healing professional or a travelling executioner, depending on the lighting. Wounds were dressed with whatever was available: wool soaked in wine, strips of leather, moss or bread crusts. Some surgeons carried their own poultice kits, mixtures of herbs, crushed snails and mouldy bread believed to draw out infection. There was a certain brutal efficiency to it all. No bedside manner, no consultations, no inspirational pamphlets. You came in broken, you left stitched, scorched, or slightly less attached to yourself. Despite their grim methods, barber surgeons were respected, especially by the lower classes. They were accessible, practical, and, unlike the robed physicians, willing to get their hands dirty. If you were a farmer, a soldier, a sailor, or anyone without a family chapel, the barber surgeon was your best chance at surviving anything sharper than a splinter. Their services were even requested by kings during war, and battlefield surgery manuals, such as those written by Henri de Mondeville or later Ambroise Paré, elevated the barber surgeon's reputation across Europe. While they were often denied formal university status, their guilds flourished. In cities like London, Paris and Nuremberg, barber surgeons had their own halls, apprenticeships and rituals, many involving bloodletting competitions, public tooth-pulling displays, and celebratory drinking that began before noon. They weren't elegant, but they were effective, at least when you survived them, and so you lie still again. Your boil has been burst, your thigh possibly less swollen, the stinging tells you you're alive, the faint smell of burned hair tells you you're healing, by medieval standards. You've now seen every tier of medical madness, the pious, the scholarly, and the sweat-soaked man with a bloody apron and suspicious grin. The barber surgeon packs up his tools. The wine is gone, your wound is wrapped, and your soul is probably still leaking from somewhere. But the healing isn't over, because the next phase doesn't go through you, it comes out of you. Specifically, from every possible orifice, at once. Your boil has been lanced, the pus has stopped hissing, the barber surgeon has moved on to his next patient, who appears to be having a toe removed with the same knife once used to slice bread and boil bandages. And just as you're beginning to believe that the worst might be over, a monk places a large ceramic bowl by your feet and a bucket beside your cot. This is not a gift. This is purging prep. Because in the grand hierarchy of medieval medicine, there's one universal truth that physicians, monks, barber surgeons, and desperate herbalists can all agree on. If you're still sick, then it's time to empty you completely. The logic of medieval purging is as straightforward as it is horrifying. If illness is caused by the imbalance of humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, then the solution is to forcibly expel the excess. Out through the mouth, out through the bowels, out through any hole that offers the slightest resistance. This was not a fringe theory. This was standard procedure. Feeling sluggish? You need to vomit. Feverish? An enema? Delirious? Time to sweat it out. Cursed by a dream about goats? Better do all three just to be safe. There were three primary categories of medieval purging: emetics, to induce vomiting; laxatives, to provoke bowel movements; diaphoretics, to trigger heavy sweating. Each had its own set of tools, techniques, and historical recipes. All of them had one thing in common: unpleasantness at velocity. Let's start with emetics. To induce vomiting, physicians recommended a range of substances that could best be described as culinary war crimes. Chief among them were herbs like hellebore, colchicum, squill, and white mustard seed. These weren't chosen for taste or aroma, they were chosen because they worked. Violently. One particularly favoured emetic was wormwood, a bitter plant so aggressively potent that even small doses could cause nausea, hallucinations, or spiritual regret. Combined with warm wine or vinegar, it could turn your stomach into a geyser. If that didn't work, more aggressive combinations were employed, such as powdered seashells mixed with goose bile or boiled radish juice steeped with crushed beetles. Recipes varied by region, but the effect was usually the same: a sustained, involuntary tribute to the floorboards. Vomiting was seen as a cleansing act. The more came up, the more illness left. A particularly dramatic purge was viewed as divine confirmation that healing was underway. Monks even recorded miraculous vomits, where patients expelled worms, bits of hair, or black bile described as oily and humming with sin. Whether these descriptions were poetic exaggerations or actual gastrointestinal events is a matter best left uninvestigated. Next came the laxatives. Unlike modern laxatives, which work discreetly and politely, medieval purgatives worked like fire alarms. There was no subtlety, no grace, just rapid, explosive urgency. The most common purgatives were herbal: senna, cassia, mallow, aloe, and rhubarb root. Some were steeped into teas, others were ground into powders and mixed with honey or vinegar. Hellebore again made an appearance, because why not reuse your most aggressive plant-based projectile producer? But if oral laxatives weren't effective, or if your physician was feeling extra enthusiastic, you were given an enema. Medieval enema syringes were usually made of horn, bone, or metal. The earliest designs consisted of a hollow tube fitted with a hand-blown bladder, or sometimes just the bladder of a sheep. The solution was poured into the device, often a warm mixture of soap, vinegar, herbs, or salted beer, and inserted into the rectum with the grace and subtlety of a farm tool. These enemas weren't optional, they were administered to peasants and kings alike. In fact, royalty often received daily enemas as part of their regular health regimen, sometimes given by personal enema specialists, a job title that mercifully went extinct. Court records from 15th century France note King Louis XI receiving over 2,000 enemas in a single year. One has to assume he was either very well cleansed or very suspicious of food. For the average patient, enemas were used in hospitals, monasteries, and bathhouses. They were prescribed for everything from gout to insomnia to moral indecisiveness. If your dreams were chaotic, your bowels were blamed. Then there were the sweat cures, known as diaphoretics. Sweating was seen as a form of purification. If the body could be coaxed into a full drenching sweat, the internal vapours that caused illness would be forced out through the pores. This could be accomplished through hot drinks, warm baths, heavy blankets, or simply lighting a fire under the patient's bed and hoping for the best. Some bathhouses specialised in sweating therapies. Patients were wrapped in layers of damp wool, then placed in steam rooms with burning herbs, sage, rosemary, juniper, and occasionally chili peppers for extra panic. The air grew so thick it could be sliced with a spoon. The patient remained in this stew of humidity until they either sweat out their illness or passed out. A sweating treatment was often followed by, you guessed it, more purging. It was believed that once the body had opened its pores, it was especially ready to evacuate everything else. All of this was part of a larger theory known as evacuation medicine. The idea was that health wasn't just the absence of disease, it was the flow of substances through the body. If any of those flows were blocked, or worse, reversed, the body would fall into crisis. You weren't just expected to urinate, defecate, spit and sweat regularly. You were expected to do them rhythmically, in accordance with the planets, the seasons, and the ever-watchful zodiac man. Failure to do so meant your humours were congested. Congestion led to putrefaction. Putrefaction led to death. Or worse, boils. So the medieval physician's job wasn't to stop the flows, it was to amplify them. As horrifying as it all sounds, purging treatments were often deeply personal. Physicians created custom purging schedules based on their patient's temperament, zodiac sign, and even their personality. If you were melancholic, black bile dominant, your purges needed to be warm and moist. If you were choleric, yellow bile, they had to be cooling and drying. If you were phlegmatic, you were seen as sluggish and needed strong spicy emetics. Sanguine, light herbal teas, and probably more music. These weren't just medical choices, they were philosophical ones. The body was viewed as a microcosm of the universe, a delicate balance of elements mirroring the cosmos. Illness wasn't a malfunction, it was an interruption in harmony, and nothing restored harmony like violently ejecting everything inside you. By the 16th century, medical scholars began to question the obsession with purging. Anatomical studies, dissections, and new understandings of digestion led some to reconsider whether daily vomiting was truly necessary. The Renaissance would eventually bring gentler treatments, better sanitation, and an appreciation for not screaming into a bucket twice a week. But in the meantime, you, the patient, are now curled up on a straw mattress soaked in sweat, your insides thoroughly reversed, your dignity scattered somewhere near the baseboard, and your physician is smiling. You've been bled, drained, sweated, vomited, and hosed out like a medieval wine barrel. Now, surely now, the illness must be gone. Unless the cause was never physical at all. Unless this entire ordeal has been the work of something invisible, something celestial. Or perhaps divine. You've been bled, boiled, blistered, drained, and thoroughly purged, from both ends and then some. Your spit has been scrutinized, your skull briefly converted into a chimney, your humours allegedly balanced, and yet you're still sick. You're starting to suspect the cause might not be inside your body at all, which is convenient because your physician has officially run out of things to burn, poke, or evacuate. So now, medieval medicine does what it always does when logic fails. It turns to the stars and sometimes to the voices of angels. This is not the part of the story where you get better. This is the part where your diagnosis is whispered in a dream by a weeping saint, confirmed by the position of Saturn, and ultimately blamed on invisible worms that may or may not exist in your spleen. Welcome to the supernatural wing of medieval diagnostics, where medicine surrenders to astrology, mysticism, divine visions, and therapeutic guesswork approved by the heavens themselves. Because when herbs, knives, and leeches fail, you start asking questions of the cosmos. Let's begin with the backbone of all medieval mystic medicine, medical astrology. To understand this concept, it helps to imagine your body as a medieval theme park, and each ride is operated by a different celestial body. The moon controls the brain and stomach. Mars rules over blood and anger. Venus manages the reproductive system and general moistness. Jupiter oversees the liver and joy. Saturn, ever the killjoy, governs the spleen, melancholy, and anything that makes you question the meaning of life. Each planet also corresponds to one or more of the four humours, and their current placement in the sky is believed to influence your internal balance. A misaligned Mars might cause spontaneous nosebleeds. An aggressive Saturn could trigger depression and constipation. A lunar eclipse? That's practically a medical emergency, and you should not, under any circumstances, be bled during it. Every respectable medieval doctor kept astrological charts. They used them to determine when to begin treatment, where to apply heat, which days to cut hair, and which nights were dangerous for digestion. Medical texts were filled with diagrams like the zodiac man, a naked figure overlaid with zodiac signs from head to toe. Aries ruled the head, Pisces ruled the feet, Virgo controlled the gut because of course she did. Surgeries were postponed if the relevant sign was in the wrong house. Bloodletting was avoided if the moon was full. And if a patient happened to be born during a solar conjunction, well, that probably explained their crooked spine and general sense of doom. This was not fringe science. This was medical orthodoxy. Astrology was taught alongside anatomy in medieval universities. Physicians who ignored it were considered reckless, and patients who questioned it were advised to pray harder and avoid goat meat during Scorpio season. But astrology wasn't the only non-physical diagnostic tool in play. If the stars didn't provide answers, many turned to the even older tradition of dream diagnosis. In monastic hospitals and village huts alike, dreams were viewed as messages from God, or warnings from devils, delivered during sleep when the soul wandered the spiritual landscape. Patients were encouraged to describe their dreams in detail. Medical guides advise physicians on how to interpret them. Dreaming of water, an imbalance of phlegm, flying, too much blood, worms crawling from your skin, a good sign, the sickness is escaping, being chased by a rooster. That could go either way depending on whether you like chickens. Some practitioners even claim to induce prophetic dreams by placing herbs under the patient's pillow, most commonly mugwort, lavender or poppy. A few took it a step further and slept beside the patient, hoping to catch the same vision and confirm the diagnosis. It was an intimate and extremely unhygienic version of peer review. Occasionally these dreams were reported to involve divine messengers. There are records of angelic diagnoses, in which saints, archangels, or even the Virgin Mary herself appeared to healers or relatives and described the cause of an illness. Sometimes they named the offending humour. Other times they offered extremely specific instructions. Burn a crow feather at dawn, bury a coin beneath the threshold, place a boiled frog on the patient's chest until it croaks. That last one wasn't metaphorical, and yes, it's coming back later in this series. When saints weren't available for consultation, patients turned to the next best thing, patron healers and relic-based medicine. Each disease had its corresponding saint. St. Roch for plague, St. Apollonia for toothaches, St. Dymphna for madness, St. Erasmus for gastrointestinal torment, particularly if you were being eviscerated by pirates. Pilgrimages were made to shrines, prayers were recited in Latin, bits of saintly bone, clothing, or vaguely blessed dust were applied to the afflicted area. If no relic was available, a wax model of the patient's infected body part could be offered instead. It was like sending a medieval health emoji to God. Religious healing wasn't always separate from medicine. Many hospitals were staffed entirely by monks and nuns who saw no conflict between prayer and purging. Diagnosis often began with confession and ended with boiling something. And then there was folk medicine, the chaotic, herb-soaked, squirrel-bone-rattling cousin of academic healing. Folk healers, midwives and cunning folk worked outside the bounds of university training. Their diagnoses came from centuries of oral tradition, local superstitions and botanical experimentation. They used signs, seasons and omens. They watched how animals reacted to a sick person. They believed in sympathetic magic, the idea that you could cure an ailment by applying something that resembled the illness itself. One particularly widespread belief was that certain diseases were caused by worms inside the body. Not literal parasites, although those were common too, but spiritual worms. Invisible, writhing agents of illness. Symptoms of worm infestation included bloating, gas, nightmares, skin irritations, melancholy, and a tendency to question authority. The cure? A variety of herbal concoctions designed to coax the worms out, sometimes through vomiting, other times through bleeding. One 14th century German text recommends holding a burning feather near the navel while reciting Psalm 38. Another suggests whispering insults into the patient's ear to offend the worms. And if none of that worked, tie a dead mole to the affected body part and wait. These methods weren't seen as irrational. They were part of a broader worldview in which the body, soul and cosmos were intimately linked. Illness could begin in the belly but take root in the stars. A boil on your thigh might be a punishment for laughing during Mass. A cough that lingered beyond winter could be the result of an angry ancestor, poor planetary alignment, or a dream you ignored. There was no boundary between the physical and metaphysical, just layers of interpretation. And if one method didn't work, you moved to the next. You've now officially entered the phase of divine speculation. The stars have been checked. Your dreams have been mined for prophecy. A monk muttered something about worms, and a very old woman just left a turnip on your windowsill and said it would help cool your fire spirits. You are somehow still alive, but the fever has returned, the wound festers, something below the skin has started to pulse. It's time for something stronger, something fermented, something that stings. Because next we turn to the most ancient, oddly effective and absolutely revolting branch of medieval wound care: honey, Moldavian wine-soaked bandages, and the quiet optimism of treating infection with kitchen scraps. Let's start with the unlikeliest hero in this entire series: honey. To a medieval healer, honey was more than food. It was an all-purpose panacea. Sweet, sticky, shelf-stable, and naturally antimicrobial, honey was used to clean wounds, soothe burns, treat eye infections, and occasionally silence coughing children. Its popularity wasn't just based on availability. Physicians actually observed that wounds treated with honey healed faster, with less swelling, less pus, and fewer maggots. They didn't know why, of course. They had no concept of bacteria, but they could see the difference. So honey became a staple in poultices and pastes. Some physicians even soaked linen bandages in honey before wrapping wounds, effectively creating early antiseptic dressings. Monks recorded its use in infirmary books, praising its divine sweetness and purging of corruption. For royal patients, honey was elevated to luxury medicine. Apothecaries blended it with gold flakes, cinnamon, rosewater, and the occasional pearl dust, transforming it into a salve fit for noble thighs and kingly boils. But for everyone else, it was just raw bee goo smeared over an open wound, and surprisingly it worked. Then there was mouldy bread. Yes, intentionally mouldy. And no, they weren't trying to invent antibiotics, though they stumbled pretty close. Throughout the Middle Ages, healers used mouldy poultices to treat wounds that were hot, red, swollen, or leaking. Mould was believed to draw out corruption and cool the blood. They didn't differentiate between moulds, green, blue, or white, as long as it was fuzzy and smelled a bit like death. Sometimes, they even specified bread from a particular bakery, presumably because the yeasts there were extra judgmental. What they didn't know was that some of these moulds, notably penicillium, did in fact contain antibacterial compounds. So while it wasn't a consistent treatment, and occasionally caused more harm than good, it wasn't entirely useless. In fact, modern historians now suspect that some cases of miraculous recovery from infected wounds in medieval times may have been due to the accidental use of mould containing early forms of penicillin. And thus, we have the bizarre irony of medieval surgeons saving lives with spoiled lunch. But if honey was the balm and mould was the mystery, wine was the weapon. Wine was everywhere in the Middle Ages. It was safer than water, easier to preserve than milk, and far more pleasant to sip while being trepanned. But beyond drinking, wine was also used in surgical cleaning. Red or white, cheap or noble, wine was poured directly into wounds, especially after battles. Its acidity and alcohol content made it mildly antiseptic, killing some bacteria and reducing visible rot. Physicians described it as cleansing the hot humours, though they had no clue about microbes. They just knew that wounds rinsed with wine didn't stink as fast. Some barber surgeons heated the wine before use, claiming the steam opened the flesh and allowed the bad vapours to escape. Others mixed wine with vinegar, herbs, or even ashes to make a kind of cleansing marinade, which was then poured over the wound until the patient either healed or passed out. Wine was also used as mouthwash, eye rinse, and, in a move that screams do not try this at home, bladder irrigation via catheter. If those staples weren't enough, medieval wound care had an entire pantry of bonus items: onions and garlic, crushed and smeared on wounds to draw out heat. Goose fat used to soothe burns and soften crusted scabs. Butter and lard sometimes mixed with chalk or ground pearls for noble patients. Egg whites applied to cuts to seal in the soul vapours. Resin and pitch slapped on wounds to harden into protective shells, or, more often, to trap infection like a medieval Tupperware container. Dressings were made of linen, wool, or animal skin. Some were reused. Some were boiled. Many were never cleaned at all. Flies were common. Maggots too, and while unintentional, maggot-infested wounds sometimes healed better, since the larvae consumed the dead flesh. Modern medicine has since rediscovered this and given it a name: biosurgical debridement. Medieval peasants just called it Tuesday. Battlefield manuals from the 14th and 15th centuries describe wound care in excruciating detail. They advise applying hot irons to severed limbs, sprinkling powder made of burnt cloth or rust, and bandaging tightly to prevent soul leakage. One French text recommends cutting away any skin that looks green, blue, or suspiciously French. Another advises filling deep wounds with honey and goose grease, covering it with a linen soaked in egg yolk and waiting until the wound sings no longer. Instructions were rarely standardized. Healing was often guided by local tradition, superstition, and a bit of trial by horrified observation. For royal patients, infection treatment became a game of decorated distraction. Rather than using plain wine or household mould, court physicians created exotic poultices, saffron-infused rags, spiced resins from the east, and jars of imported oils blessed by travelling monks. One Hungarian queen was reportedly treated with wine infused with powdered emeralds, a procedure that worked, presumably, because her symptoms gave up out of confusion. Some kings demanded only gold leaf dressings, while others had court alchemists develop antisepsis elixirs, which were, in reality, very expensive vinegar with mood lighting. None of this was especially effective, but if you were going to die of gangrene, you might as well do it with dignity and a mouthful of cinnamon. Despite the chaos, there were moments of brilliance. A 12th century Islamic surgeon, al-Zahrawi, described detailed wound cleaning procedures that closely resemble modern debridement. He emphasized cleanliness, fresh dressings, and minimizing pus, a radical stance in a world that considered pus the sign of a good healing. His translated texts influenced European medicine for centuries, especially among the few physicians who still believed in observation over incense. Monastic infirmaries, too, occasionally followed routines that accidentally resembled sterile care. Boiling bandages, limiting visitors, keeping animals out of the sick room. Unfortunately, they also believed in applying relics and chanting hymns over pus. Still, it was a start. And so your wound is cleaned, if we can call it that. It has been soaked in vinegar wine, smothered in honey, sprinkled with herbs that may or may not be rosemary, and wrapped in a linen that was either blessed or previously worn as underpants. The pain is real, the smell is assertive, but the swelling has gone down, the oozing has slowed. You may yet live, unless, of course, you have the plague. You don't have a cough anymore, you have the cough. You're not just sweaty, you're glistening with medieval terror, and that black tender lump in your groin. It's either a swollen lymph node or a divine invitation to your own funeral. Either way, there's no time left, because when the plague arrives, medicine packs its bags and leaves the continent. The Black Death was not just a disease, it was a cataclysm. Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague swept through Europe with a fury unmatched in the history of human infection. It killed somewhere between 75 to 200 million people, reducing populations, economies, and belief systems to rubble. And yet, for all its scale, no one knew what was causing it. No germ theory, no understanding of transmission, just a rapidly spreading horror that seemed to ignore class, piety, and planetary alignment. Faced with an unstoppable invisible killer, medieval medicine did what it did best. It turned to flower arrangements and loud noises. Let's begin with the fashion icon of this particular era, the plague doctor. Most famously depicted in the long robe, gloves, and terrifying bird-like mask, the plague doctor was hired by cities to examine and record the sick and dying. Despite the aesthetic, he was often not a highly trained physician, more often a low-level official or someone who drew the short straw in the town council. The beak-shaped mask was functional in theory. It was stuffed with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and vinegar-soaked sponges, anything thought to neutralize the miasma, or bad air, believed to spread disease. Common ingredients included rose petals, lavender, mint, cloves, camphor, and myrrh. Occasionally a dash of dried snake or powdered unicorn horn, depending on budget. The mask wasn't meant to protect against germs. Those hadn't been invented yet. It was meant to filter the air of spiritual filth. The rest of the plague doctor's uniform was similarly defensive. Long waxed robes to protect the skin, gloves, a cane for poking patients from a safe distance, boots, and in some cases, a small notebook because nothing says hope like writing down your symptoms before fainting in a hay pile. But the real work of fighting the plague didn't fall to the doctors, it fell to everyone else and their fire pits. Because when the plague came to town, the first order of business was to burn everything that smelled suspicious. Public health officials, often the local bishop or a very stressed monk, would order the burning of bedding, clothing, straw mattresses, furniture, pets. Yes, sadly. Books, especially if they looked French. Anything belonging to the deceased. Sometimes entire homes if the owner looked particularly contagious. The belief was that the air itself carried the disease. This wasn't entirely wrong. They just didn't realise fleas and rats were involved. But the obsession with air meant that anything producing a foul smell was seen as a threat. And so herbs were burned en masse. Frankincense, sage, rosemary, juniper, and vinegar-soaked rags were thrown into cauldrons and torched. Streets were filled with smoke, not just from pyres of the dead, but from aromatic counterattacks. Entire neighbourhoods reeked of rotting wood, overcooked thyme, and unearned optimism. If you couldn't afford a personal herbal inferno, you might carry a posy, a small bundle of fragrant herbs tied around your neck, wrist, or cane. The idea was to create a protective aroma barrier between you and the toxic air. This gave birth to the old nursery rhyme. Ring-a-ring-a roses, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Yes, it's a plague song. And yes, that falling down part is as literal as it sounds. For those already infected, treatment options were grim. Bloodletting, of course, was the first step, even though most plague victims were already bleeding internally. Pigeon carcasses were applied to buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that defined bubonic plague. Boil lancing was common, but often fatal, since the pus was highly infectious. Some physicians recommended applying dried human feces or crushed emeralds, proving that desperation and wealth do not mix well. One particularly creative French remedy involved sitting in a sewer for several hours, under the theory that the stronger stench would chase the bad air away. None of it worked. Patients died within days, sometimes hours. Entire households vanished overnight. Gravediggers ran out of land. Priests ran out of prayers. Monks who had spent their lives writing about humility were suddenly too busy burying their co-workers to write anything at all. And yet cities kept records. Doctors, when not running for their lives, recorded symptoms: blackened limbs, fevers, delirium, vomiting, and the distinctive buboes, those hideous lumps in the armpits, groin, and neck that oozed, swelled, and eventually ruptured. We now know that these symptoms describe Yersinia pestis, the bacterium carried by fleas living on rats, which were drawn to Europe's piles of garbage, rotting food, and general indifference to sanitation. But in the 14th century, the culprit could just as easily have been sin, or Saturn, or spoiled cheese. Some physicians blamed moist air from swamps, others blamed Jewish communities, resulting in horrific pogroms. Some said it was God's punishment, others blamed bad planetary conjunctions or witches boiling frogs too loudly. Whatever the explanation, the solution remained the same: burn herbs, burn linens, and hope. A few cities tried quarantine. Venice famously isolated ships at sea for 40 days, hence the term quarantina, or quarantine. Others tried curfews, travel bans, or mass processions of flagellants, whipping themselves in the street to appease divine wrath. That didn't work either, but at least it passed the time, and yet, some people survived. It was inexplicable. A neighbour who slept beside a dying victim walked away unscathed. A nurse exposed to 5 cases in a week developed a mild fever and nothing more. A child sick with buboes one day was walking the next, forever immune and suspiciously smug about it. These survivors were considered blessed, or occasionally suspicious. Many faced accusations of witchcraft, demonic protection, or unnatural resistance. Others were honoured. A few, if noble enough, were even declared medically untouchable, immune from all future disease by royal decree, no pressure. And so here you are, sweating, shaking, breathing in a soup of rosemary smoke, goat fur and regret. Your doctor is gone, your neighbours are praying, the monks are burying someone named Brother Timothy for the 3rd time this week, and your fate? Unclear. You may die by dawn, or you may be one of the lucky few who wakes up tomorrow scarred but alive. If you do, you'll be stronger, but no healthier, because surviving the plague doesn't fix your ulcers, or your boils, or that weird clicking in your hip. It just buys you enough time to get sick royally again. You deserve a medal at this point. You didn't die from the plague. You weren't bled dry by a sleepy monk. You survived your leeching, your trepanation, and your medieval juice cleanse. And now you've been upgraded, not in health, but in status. You've been admitted to the royal sick room. This should be comforting. After all, you're in a castle. The sheets are silk. The pillows are stuffed with swan feathers. A lute player has been hired specifically to play slow, tasteful dirges while you vomit into a golden bowl. But make no mistake, the medicine in here is no better than what was offered to peasants. It just smells fancier and costs 20 times as much. The royal sick room is a curious contradiction. It is lavish, but unclean, heavily guarded yet crawling with lice, rich in relics, ointments and brocade, but poor in actual medical success. The core problem is this. While peasants were treated by monks and barber surgeons, nobles were fortunate enough to be treated by court physicians, men who had read every Galenic text, passed every academic exam, and still thought your spleen was melting because Mars was cranky. These doctors were obsessed with optics, not actual eyes, but appearances. They wore robes trimmed with mink, they quoted Avicenna in Latin, they carried velvet-bound urine wheels and pearl-handled lancets, and they charged per sneeze. The royal sick room was always full. If the king had a headache, his chamber was immediately packed with herbalists, astrologers, leech handlers, scribes, and 3 nervous apothecaries ready to blame each other when something exploded. The queen's chamber was little better, filled with midwives, holy relics, amulets, and jars of ointment labelled with symbols that only made sense after wine. Every royal illness, no matter how minor, became a diplomatic crisis. Was it indigestion or poisoning, a fever or a divine punishment? Should they call for prayer or the guy with the hot tongs? The result was medical chaos wrapped in silk ribbon. Let's talk about the treatments. First up, gold. Actual gold. Flakes of it. Powdered nuggets. Liquid gold distillation served in goblets and rubbed into temples. It was believed that gold carried life-giving energy and celestial purity, the very essence of incorruptibility. Never mind that it didn't absorb well and probably gave everyone mercury poisoning when mixed incorrectly. If gold didn't work, there were spices, cinnamon, clove, saffron and cardamom, not for flavour, but for warming the humours. These were imported at great expense and applied liberally to everything. Bandages, poultices, even wounds. Nothing says recovery like a cinnamon-scented stab hole. Then there were the poultices, thick hot applications of herbs, animal fat, crushed minerals and optimism, smeared onto infected areas like medieval pesto. Popular royal poultice ingredients included goose fat, vinegar, crushed pearls, rose oil, burnt ivory ash, occasionally crushed emeralds for those suffering from spleen envy, and if all else failed, a whole roasted onion, halved and tied to the armpit. The effectiveness of these treatments varied, which is to say they generally didn't work but looked impressive while failing. For internal issues, royalty turned to alchemists. These were not doctors. They were more like magical pharmacists with anxiety disorders. Their chambers were filled with bubbling glassware, coded notebooks, and the perpetual smell of sulphur and fraud. They promised elixirs, tinctures that would purge melancholy, restore vitality and extend life. The ingredients were always mysterious. Dragon's blood, philosopher's salt, dissolved pearls, and spirit of antimony, which was essentially toxic metallic dust. To the desperate royal, these potions were irresistible. After all, if a peasant could survive with mouldy bread and a toad necklace, surely the king deserved transmuted wine infused with starlight and ground ruby. Unfortunately, most elixirs achieved two things: diarrhea, death, sometimes in that order, and let's not forget the royal enema. You might think that once you've reached the highest level of power, people would stop inserting things into your rectum. You'd be wrong. Royal enemas were practically ceremonial. Administered daily in some courts, they were infused with wine, herbs, milk, honey, and occasionally perfume, not to clean the bowels, but to nourish them. There were dedicated royal enema specialists whose job it was to select the perfect temperature and consistency for the king's internal irrigation. It was not a glamorous position, but it was a stable one, at least until the pipes burst. The royal sick room also relied heavily on relics and blessings. Saintly bones were brought in and waved over the patient. Holy water was sprinkled on the pillows. Sometimes the sheets were changed. Sometimes, if the illness worsened, things escalated and psalms were read aloud. Offerings were made at nearby shrines. Roosters were sacrificed, quietly behind the herb garden. One desperate duke even had 40 monks chant simultaneously, which cured nothing but made sleep impossible. All of this was accompanied by a total lack of sanitation. Chamber pots were used, and not always emptied. Food trays sat for days. Rats were frequent visitors. Bathing was optional and discouraged during fever, lest the pores open and let the bad air in. In short, the royal sick room was a plush plague den. Now, despite all this, some royals did survive, not because of the treatments, but in spite of them. They survived because they were well fed, isolated from the worst of society's filth, and sometimes just lucky. They weren't healed by gold powder or alchemical wine. They were healed by time, rest, and the occasional clean wound. Of course, when they recovered, credit went straight to the astrologer who declared Mercury had entered a less combative house. If they died? Well, the court would blame the stars, or the food taster, or the French, but never the physician. He would bow solemnly, declare the soul at peace, and then present his invoice. So here you are, wrapped in velvet, drenched in myrrh, your fever unchanged, your stomach rebelling against the clove poultice someone applied internally. You're breathing incense. Your nurse is whispering to a bone fragment in a glass box. And someone just brought in a peacock to absorb the illness with its noble aura. This is not healthcare. This is expensive flailing. And soon, it's going to get worse. Because you're about to meet the medieval physician's favourite tools, and they belong in a torture chamber. You're lying in the royal sick room wrapped in silk and regret, still smelling faintly of peacock and burned rosemary. You've been bled, blistered, bathed in wine, and possibly sprinkled with ground sapphire. You might reasonably assume that the worst is behind you. You would be wrong, because now the doctor is opening his kit. Not the nice one with the gold leaf ointments and celestial charts. No, this is the other kit. The practical one, the one made of oak and iron, the one that makes you wonder if you're being healed or interrogated. This is the moment when you realise medieval doctors and executioners used very similar toolboxes. To a modern eye, the medieval surgical toolkit looks more like something you'd find on the wall of a dungeon, and in many cases that's exactly where it ended up when the patient didn't survive. But for centuries, this gruesome array of steel, bone, wood and twine was the frontline arsenal of medical care. Let's start with the basics, the cutting tools. These were the medieval equivalent of scalpels, only less precise and more machete-adjacent. The most common blade was the lancet, a small double-edged knife used for bloodletting, boil lancing and minor incisions. Think of it as the Swiss Army knife of 1349, minus the corkscrew and plus a healthy disregard for sterilisation. Then there were fleams, a type of spring-loaded blade used by barber surgeons to open veins with speed and flourish. They looked like miniature meat cleavers and were often stored in rolled leather pouches next to things like bone saws and prayer beads. If the patient had something that needed cutting, the doctor had something sharp and vaguely horrifying to oblige. But sometimes, cutting wasn't enough. Sometimes you needed to remove something. Enter the forceps, long iron pincers used to extract arrows, teeth, splinters, or, in particularly ill-conceived moments, kidney stones. There were also hooked probes, spatulas, and scoops, tools designed to scrape out infected tissue, clean wounds, or dig for abscesses. These instruments looked almost decorative until they were halfway into your thigh, searching for hot pus. And then there was the infamous tooth key. A medieval marvel of bad design and worse hygiene, the tooth key was a metal rod with a rotating claw. It was inserted into the mouth, latched onto the offending tooth, and twisted. Not pulled, twisted. Like opening a wine bottle from inside your face, tooth extraction was done without anesthesia. If you passed out, that was considered both efficient and polite. For deeper wounds, or those that bled too freely, our doctors turned to cautery irons. These were long, flat metal rods, often shaped like paddles, crosses, or wedges. Heated over open flame until they glowed, they were applied directly to bleeding wounds or surgical sites to stop blood flow, kill infection, or calm the humours. Some were even designed for branding, literally burning protective symbols or religious marks into the skin. It was less medicine and more theological welding. The use of cautery wasn't limited to emergencies. Physicians used it as a preventative measure. One 13th century French manual recommends burning the back of the neck to relieve headaches and promote honest thoughts. In case you were wondering, no, that didn't work. The tool that most resembled its modern descendant was the bone saw. Roughly the size of a modern hacksaw, it was used for amputations, skull surgery, and removing infected limbs. It came in both straight and curved designs. Curved for legs, straight for everything else. Some were decorated, others were simple, all were terrifying. Bone saws weren't cleaned. They were rinsed, sometimes, sharpened, occasionally, and reused until they broke or the teeth fell out. By then, the patient usually had two. One of the more disturbing items in the kit was the trepan, or cranial drill. This tool was used for trepanation, drilling a hole into the skull to relieve pressure, remove demons, or just let the heat out. Trepanation was performed with hand-crank drills or circular saws with teeth. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just a firm grip, a clean forehead, and the sound of grinding bone. Trepan tools were often passed down through generations. The same instrument that once relieved migraines in a Flemish soldier might later cure melancholy in a noblewoman, and eventually be buried with a monk, just in case he needed to release the soul vapours after death. Doctors also carried sewing tools, for closing wounds, reattaching skin, or in some brave cases cosmetic repairs. Needles were thick, thread was coarse, the technique resembled leatherwork more than surgery. Some physicians used silk thread for nobles and catgut for everyone else. Others simply used whatever string was nearby, dipped in wine or spit, and hoped the wound didn't smell like cheese after 3 days. Wounds were sewn shut quickly, often in battlefield conditions, and then covered with poultices made of honey, fat, or ashes. The goal wasn't beauty, it was survival, and even that was a stretch. Now here's where things get unsettling. Many of these tools were identical to those used in judicial torture. Hooks, spikes, iron tongs. The overlap was so consistent that in some towns, surgeons and executioners shared equipment. There are recorded cases of a patient being treated with the same cautery iron used earlier that week to interrogate a suspected thief. In theory, medicine and torture were separate disciplines. In practice, they often occupied the same space, particularly in prisons, battlefields and plague houses. Even the language was similar. Purging sin, drawing out evil, calming the demons. Whether healing or harming, the process looked nearly identical. So where did these tools come from? Most were crafted by local blacksmiths, based on centuries of tradition, battlefield improvisation, and very little feedback from survivors. There were no medical regulations, no testing. If a tool looked vaguely like it could slice, scrape, or suck something out of a hole, it was added to the kit. Some surgical manuals, like Guy de Chauliac's Chirurgia Magna, 1363, provided illustrations of toolkits, complete with handwritten notes like, for abscesses of the thigh, or use only during eclipses. Barber surgeons often wore their smaller tools on their belts, like medieval Batman, but with less subtlety and far more blood. Did any of this work? Occasionally. Bone saws could remove gangrenous limbs before infection spread. Trepanation sometimes relieved pressure after head trauma. Cautery stopped bleeding, at least until infection set in. But most of these tools caused more harm than good. They introduced bacteria, tore tissue, and left patients screaming, unconscious, or both. And yet, for hundreds of years, they remained the best available option. Because the real problem wasn't the tools, it was the complete lack of understanding of the human body. There was no concept of sterilization, no anesthesia, no germ theory, no antibiotics, no basic hygiene protocols. Tools were reused, misused, and handed down like cursed heirlooms, and every time they were opened, someone suffered. Not out of cruelty, but out of hope, out of the desperate belief that pain might produce healing, that metal might fix what humors could not. And so here you lie, surrounded by forceps, bone saws, curved blades, and boiling irons. Your body is weak, your humors, probably arguing in Latin, and your physician is confidently selecting a tool that looks suspiciously like a branding fork. It's time to leave the doctor's toolkit behind and face the next step in medieval recovery, the hospital. Because surely things will be better in an actual institution dedicated to the care of the sick, won't they? The doctor has done all he can, or at least all he's willing to do without another goat in payment. Your wound is seeping, your humors are allegedly in conflict, and your dreams involve angels handing you chamber pots. Which means it's time for what every medieval patient dreads and every family insists upon. You're being moved to a hospital. Now let's clear something up right away. This is not a hospital in the modern sense. There are no clean white linens, no beeping machines, no quiet sterile hallways. There's a monk with a ladle, a nun who smells like vinegar, and a bed that was last changed when Charlemagne was still breathing. This is not a place to recover. It is, more often than not, a place to die, slowly, prayerfully, and covered in a respectful number of lice. The medieval hospital, or hospital, was less a medical institution and more a spiritual boarding house. Founded primarily by religious orders, these establishments were designed not to cure the sick, but to provide them with charity, dignity, and a straight path to heaven. Healing was optional. Dying with your soul intact? Mandatory. Hospitals were usually attached to monasteries or churches. Their mission? To care for the sick, the poor, the elderly, the orphan, the leprous, and anyone else society had no idea what to do with. In other words, everyone who made polite company uncomfortable. Once admitted, you're laid out on a wooden bed with a thin straw mattress, not just thin from use but shared. Beds were frequently occupied by 2 or more patients at once, sometimes 3 if someone was exceptionally small or already dead. There were no curtains, no privacy, no personal space, just one long hall filled with coughs, moans, and the distant clanking of a monk boiling turnips next to a severed foot. Hospitals were built for the soul first, the body second. Nursing care focused on cleanliness, feeding, and administering the sacraments. Prayer was constant, offered hourly for the living and the dead, who conveniently often occupied adjacent beds. The sick were encouraged to confess, not just to unburden the soul, but because death was likely imminent. Nuns walked the rows with holy water, herbs and compassion. Monks read scripture at the bedside. Liturgical chanting was standard background noise, not quite soothing, but at least vaguely rhythmic. There were, of course, treatments. Most involved basic wound care, herbal remedies, or spiritual intervention. Hospitals had apothecaries, often managed by a monk or a particularly enthusiastic nun with a mortar and pestle. Common ingredients included wormwood, valerian, rose oil, vinegar, ground bone, urine, always urine. Whatever was left over from the last plague wave. Poultices were applied, pus was scraped, and if things got really dire, you might be sent to the bleeding corner, where leeches lounged in ceramic jars waiting to ruin your Tuesday. But most care was palliative. You were not here to get better. You were here to get clean, holy, and out of the way. Hospitals were notoriously overcrowded. They admitted the sick, the dying, the destitute, and the random traveller who happened to cough near the bishop. Space was limited. Resources were few. The staff was overworked and underwashed. Ventilation was poor. Windows were tiny, if they existed at all. Candles were the main source of light, creating the perfect ambience for spiritual reflection and respiratory illness. And then there were the lice. Lice were not just common, they were inescapable. Patients brought them in, beds incubated them, cloaks and blankets spread them like medieval confetti. Nuns did their best, combing, delousing, sometimes even shaving patients entirely, but the lice always won. Some healers even considered lice to be part of the healing process. It was believed they drew out bad humours, fed on corruption, or served as divine reminders not to be vain about your hair. Food was served once or twice a day, depending on supply and theology. Meals were often simple: gruel, broth, bread, and occasionally bits of salted meat or vegetables. On fasting days, which were numerous, you received spiritual sustenance instead, which is another way of saying less gruel. There was little thought given to calories, nutrients, or hydration. The emphasis was on humble eating, which conveniently aligned with the fact that most hospitals were poor and couldn't afford salt. Sanitation was theoretical. Chamber pots were shared. Beds were rarely changed. Floors were covered in rushes, occasionally fresh, but more often lightly trampled compost with dreams of being straw again. Rats roamed freely. Cats roamed to eat the rats. Dogs roamed to eat the leftovers, and people roamed too, coughing, weeping, mumbling, sometimes naked and trying to barter for extra broth using toe bones. Water for washing was limited, baths were rare, smells were permanent. Yet despite all this, medieval hospitals served a critical role. They provided shelter, warmth, and dignity to those who would otherwise die in the street. They created community care before the concept had a name, and for many, they were the only place where death came with witnesses and a prayer. There were moments of genuine comfort, a nurse adjusting your blanket, a monk offering soft bread and gentler words, a warm fire crackling beside a row of snoring patients, each one battling their own private apocalypse. And for those who survived, discharge was often a simple affair. Your fever broke, your humours stopped weeping, and you were sent home with a crust of bread and a stern warning not to relapse during Lent. But for most, the hospital was the final stop, and your soul's forwarding address was heavily documented. So here you are, in a room lit by candlelight and shadowed by incense smoke, surrounded by quiet prayer, hushed footsteps, and a chorus of night coughs. The lice are still here, the nun still smiles, and the man next to you is definitely dead, but at least he's not snoring anymore. You've made it to the heart of medieval care, and yet, your journey isn't over, because someone just rolled in a celestial chart and refuses to examine you until Venus exits retrograde. You've gone through hell, and now, Just when it seems like your last chance at treatment has arrived, the physician pulls out a star chart and begins to frown. You ask if he's going to examine your wound. He informs you that Capricorn is currently occupying your spleen. Welcome to the astronomical side of medieval medicine, where your recovery plan depends less on your symptoms and more on whether Saturn is being dramatic this week. In the medieval mind, the universe was a clock. The stars and planets were not just distant orbs, they were part of a massive divine mechanism. The human body, in all its sweaty, leaky mystery, was just another gear in that machine. And just like tides follow the moon, the liver follows Jupiter. This wasn't superstition. This was mainstream science, taught in universities, debated in scholarly circles, and enforced by physicians with absolutely no interest in treating you until the stars agreed. The foundation of this logic came from two sources: Hellenistic astrology, a sophisticated blend of Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian thought that treated the heavens like a cosmic spreadsheet; Galenic medicine, which taught that the body was ruled by 4 humours, each of which corresponded to elements, seasons, and, you guessed it, planetary bodies. This fusion gave birth to medical astrology, the belief that every part of your body is governed by a celestial sign, and that illness occurs when those signs are out of alignment. This wasn't niche knowledge. It was printed in textbooks, almanacs, and illustrated scrolls with naked men covered in zodiac symbols, the infamous Zodiac Man diagrams, standing with arms outstretched like they're trying to hug the moon. Here's how it worked. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck and throat, Gemini the arms and lungs, Cancer the chest and stomach, Leo the heart, Virgo the intestines, Libra the kidneys, Scorpio the reproductive organs, of course, Sagittarius the thighs, Capricorn the knees, Aquarius the shins, Pisces the feet. This meant that a sore throat wasn't just a sore throat, it was a Taurus problem. A cramp in your thigh, Sagittarius is clearly in distress. Stub your toe on the chamber pot, Pisces is out for revenge. Treatment had to be timed carefully. Bleed someone when the moon is in Virgo and you might accidentally draw down the energy meant for digestion. Perform surgery on a Wednesday while Mercury is in retrograde. You're practically inviting death by pus. Surgeries and bloodletting sessions were scheduled using planetary hours and days. Sunday was ruled by the Sun, Monday by the Moon, Tuesday by Mars, Wednesday by Mercury, Thursday by Jupiter, Friday by Venus, Saturday by Saturn. So if you had a liver issue, governed by Jupiter, you'd ideally be treated on Thursday, during Jupiter's planetary hour, preferably when the moon wasn't waxing and Saturn wasn't being a celestial gremlin. If that meant delaying your treatment for 6 days while your leg doubled in size and developed a new smell, so be it. The stars had spoken. Astrology charts were also used for diagnosis. Physicians created horoscopes of illness, birth charts that mapped not only your personality, but also your predisposition to disease. A melancholic man born under Saturn in winter, likely to suffer from black bile excess and spleen hardness. A phlegmatic woman born under the moon in Pisces, susceptible to watery illnesses and mood swings during eclipses. There were even horoscopes cast at the moment of falling ill. This decumbiture chart was used to predict when, or if, you would recover. It was considered especially ominous if Mars or Saturn beheld your house of health, in which case your physician might quietly pack up his kit and recommend a priest. This wasn't just an elite preoccupation. Town healers, apothecaries, and travelling astrologers also used zodiac-based calendars to sell treatments. Medical almanacs were printed, eventually, and hand-copied before that, showing favourable days for bloodletting, purging, and dream interpretation. You could walk into a village square and see a public chart hanging next to the fish prices, listing advice like, "Do not cut the hair during Cancer, lest the brain grow weary." Mars in Aries, Beware quarrels and nosebleeds. A good day for enemas, moon in Libra. Avoid strong wine, Venus is resting. Imagine being told not to drink because Venus is having a spa day. Now, did any of this work? Not in a medical sense. But it did something more powerful than cure disease. It provided structure, predictability, meaning. In a world where illness came suddenly and without explanation, astrology turned chaos into a cosmic schedule. It gave the illusion that someone, or something, was in control, that your suffering was not random but written in the sky long before your birth, which was deeply comforting, until your physician pointed out that Mars just entered your 8th house, and now they won't touch you until it exits. There were critics, of course. The church had a complicated relationship with astrology. It was tolerated when used for health or agriculture. After all, the Magi followed a star, but condemned when it veered into divination or free will denial. By the 13th century, university-trained doctors were quietly encouraged to use astrology discreetly, or else wrap it in a thick layer of theology. Some complied, others doubled down. By the 14th century, medical astrology was standard curriculum. Even if you didn't believe it, you were expected to know it, and to use it in front of patients who very much believed. And so, here you are, sick, sore, slightly glowing from your last mercury elixir, and now staring at a man who refuses to lance your abscess, because the moon is square with Mars. You're surrounded by herbs, covered in ash. Your leg is twice its normal size, and your fate hangs on whether Gemini can get its act together before sunset. At least the lute music is nice, but don't close your eyes just yet, because the stars may delay your surgery, but your boils won't. Boils in medieval Europe weren't just common, they were cultural landmarks. They showed up on the rich and the poor, the young and the elderly, and often in places where polite company would rather not look. Caused by infected hair follicles, poor hygiene, bacterial infiltration, or the wrath of Saint Apollonia, depending on who you asked. Boils were seen as both punishment and opportunity, because when a boil got big, red and ripe, that meant it was ready to burst, or more commonly, ready to be opened, with a knife in front of witnesses, possibly while someone played a lute. Let's talk about the procedure. First, the patient was examined, not with gloves or privacy, but with the sort of public enthusiasm usually reserved for livestock auctions. Surgeons, especially barber surgeons, would press, prod and declare whether the boil was mature. If it jiggled like cheese curd, leaked yellowish fluid, or smelled like disappointment, it was declared ready. Out came the instruments, a sharp lancet or curved knife for slicing, a heated spatula or iron to cauterize if needed, and a rag, often previously used to catch the spray. An assistant held the patient down, or the patient gripped a wooden rod, a prayer book, or just screamed into their own cloak. Alcohol, if available, was drunk liberally beforehand, not to disinfect, but to encourage the patient to stop caring. The incision was swift. The boil burst. The crowd usually cheered, because yes, these lancing events were often public, especially if the patient was a noble or wealthy merchant. Boil lancing was a spectacle. It was proof that the body could be subdued, that the surgeon had power, and that the crowd could all enjoy a cathartic moment together while pretending their own skin didn't itch. Some surgeons brought apprentices who used the event as a learning experience and a test of nerve. Others brought assistants with instruments like spatulas, tongs and wound hooks to explore the pus cavity and determine whether bad humours remained. There was also the critical post-lancing moment, judging the pus. Yes, medieval physicians were obsessed with pus. It was believed that different types of pus indicated different stages of healing. For example, white, creamy pus was laudable, a good sign of the body purging corruption. Yellow, thin pus indicated lingering disease. Green or black pus meant you should begin drafting your will. No pus at all, possibly demonic. definitely suspicious. Medical texts from the time are filled with instructions for interpreting exudate, which sounds like a polite way of saying poke the wound and squint thoughtfully. Once drained, the open sore was stuffed with various substances, depending on the surgeon's training and the hospital's pantry. Common fillers included honey for its antibacterial properties, a rare case of logic, wine-soaked cloth to cleanse and encourage healing, herbal poultices made with sage, wormwood, or rose petals, animal fat, because everything in medieval medicine comes back to rubbing dead things on living things. The wound might then be cauterized with a heated iron to seal it, or it might be left open to weep until the next inspection. Some wounds were even sung over. Chanting was believed to soothe the spirit, ward off infection, and distract everyone from the smell. Why public? Because medicine in this period was part performance, part punishment, and part holy act. People gathered to watch, not out of cruelty, but out of fascination. Boyle surgeries were equal parts education, entertainment, and warning. A medieval TED talk in which the slides were made of pus. They also served a social function. For nobles, it was proof that they could suffer with dignity. For surgeons, it was a marketing opportunity. For commoners, it was a reminder that hygiene was a luxury. For everyone else, it was a Tuesday. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, it actually helped. Drainage reduced pressure, honey reduced infection, heat-sealed wounds, pus interpretation, while unscientific, sometimes got lucky. But the risks were enormous. Boils that weren't fully drained could return, larger and more infected. Instruments weren't sterilized, surgeons weren't always trained, and sometimes the incision was too deep, cutting into muscle or major vessels and turning a minor procedure into an impromptu funeral. Even successful boil lancing came with complications, secondary infections, scarring, gangrene, spiritual crises, chronic embarrassment if it happened on your birthday. Some patients tried to avoid the ordeal by using home remedies, applying figs to draw out the swelling, rubbing with sheep dung, a classic, chanting protective verses, sleeping with herbs in their undergarments. But if a boil reached a certain size, described in some texts as larger than a quail egg but smaller than a heretic's lie, you were expected to submit, and ideally to do so without crying in public. Eventually your boil is declared empty. The wound is packed. The crowd disperses. You are praised for your bravery, though you mostly remember screaming. You're told the healing has begun, though you can't shake the feeling that something lumpy still lurks just below the surface. Your physician smiles. Next time, he says, we'll use the walnut paste. You're bandaged, bruised, and recovering from a boil lancing that resembled a Gallagher comedy show. You're not bleeding as much. Your humours have calmed, and you've almost forgiven the surgeon for describing your pus as playfully aggressive. But your headaches persist, and naturally that means one thing. It's walnut time. Because in the ever-wise logic of medieval medicine, the best cure for brain trouble is to eat a thing that looks like a brain. Welcome to the doctrine of signatures, the botanical belief that God placed clues in nature to help humans self-diagnose, a kind of divine game of charades, played with plants, body parts, and spectacularly bad guesses. Here's how it worked. According to this doctrine, which gained popularity in medieval and Renaissance Europe, every plant was signed by God to reveal its use. That is, its shape, colour, texture, or even smell indicated what part of the human body it was meant to heal. If a leaf looked like a liver, it healed the liver. If a root resembled a tooth, rub it on your gums. If a flower bloomed like an open eye, great. You now had medieval eye drops. It was less about chemistry, and more about visual poetry. And by poetry, we mean hallucinated guesswork with excellent conviction. The walnut was the poster child of this movement. Crack one open and look inside. The shell resembles a skull. The meat inside looks uncannily like two brain hemispheres. There are even little creases and lobes, folds of thought, if you will. So naturally, healers believed walnuts could treat brain disorders, especially those linked to melancholy, madness, headaches, or memory loss. Walnuts were made into pastes, teas, and amalgams with honey, sometimes spread across the forehead, sometimes shoved up the nose, and occasionally just thrown at the patient when things got really bad. No one knew why it worked. Spoiler, it didn't. But it looked right, and that was enough. The walnut was only the beginning. Here are some other shining stars of the doctrine of signatures. Liverwort. Because its lobed leaves resembled the human liver, it was prescribed for liver ailments. It did nothing, but at least it was fun to say. Eyebright, euphrasia, with petals that looked vaguely like eyes. This flower was steeped into tea and used to treat vision issues. Fun fact, it was also used to repel witches, because nothing says clear sight like defensive horticulture. Lungwort pulmonaria, with blotchy leaves that resembled diseased lungs. It was obviously meant to treat lung diseases like tuberculosis and lung rot. Did it work? Only if you consider death a form of healing. Bloodroot. This plant oozed red sap when cut, so it was believed to help with blood disorders. Ironically, it's also highly toxic if ingested, so it often cured blood problems by eliminating the person entirely. Toothwort. Its white, jagged roots looked like teeth, so it was used for toothaches, which is adorable, until you realise medieval dentistry often involved hammers. Mandrake root, with limbs and sometimes horrifyingly human-like shapes. These roots were associated with fertility, sleep, and madness. They were also rumoured to scream when pulled from the ground, which led to the infamous dog-pulling method. Tie a rope to the root, attach it to a dog, and run away while it harvested itself. If you're thinking that sounds like a bad idea, it was. Dogs didn't enjoy it, and neither did the patients. The doctrine of signatures wasn't invented in Europe, but it flourished there. Its roots, pun intended, go back to ancient Greek and Roman natural philosophy, but it was popularised in the Middle Ages and Renaissance by thinkers like Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and alchemist who firmly believed that God had hidden cures in the appearance of herbs. Paracelsus wrote, "Nature marks each growth according to the disease it is good for," which sounds very poetic until someone hands you a fig leaf for a hernia. Healers compiled herbals, thick illustrated manuals showing plants and their signatures. These books were passed from monk to monk, copied laboriously by hand, and treated with the reverence normally reserved for holy scripture or unusually large cheeses. Sometimes the signatures got wildly creative. Carrots sliced into rounds resembled eyes, so they were used for vision, a belief that actually contains a kernel of truth thanks to beta-carotene, but that's an accident more than a plan. Kidney beans, shaped like kidneys, were used for, you guessed it, kidney health. Snakeskin-looking roots were used against snake bites because clearly, sympathetic magic works best when it's deeply ironic. The idea even extended to colours. Yellow flowers for jaundice, red roots for bleeding disorders, black petals for melancholy, or perhaps just to depress you further. Green leaves for, well, everything, because 90% of plants are green. Of course, this system had zero basis in chemistry or actual anatomy. But that didn't stop people from believing in it for centuries. Even some early scientists tried to retrofit the doctrine into emerging medical knowledge, desperately trying to find phytochemicals in plants that supported the visual clues they had already assigned. Unfortunately, looks like a pancreas was not a strong scientific metric. By the 17th century, the doctrine began to lose credibility among academic physicians. But in folk medicine, rural communities and certain monastic circles, it persisted. Because here's the thing, when you're desperate, sick and surrounded by suffering, you look for signs. And if that sign happens to be a nut that looks like your throbbing brain, you're going to grind it up and pray. even if it just gives you a headache and mild intestinal betrayal. So here you are, slathered in walnut paste, wrapped in linen, breathing through one nostril because someone stuffed the other with sage. You smell like a harvest festival gone wrong. Your thoughts feel no clearer, and your doctor is now pressing a liver-shaped leaf against your ribs and humming softly. At least your spleen hasn't spoken today. That's a win. You've survived the walnut cure, mostly. Your headache remains, your rash has developed what could charitably be described as personality, and your physician, who's now dressed in robes embroidered with the moon, has decided it's time for a new treatment. No more herbs, no more leeches, no more boiled root paste. No. This time he reaches into a pouch, pulls out a small dried toad, and calmly declares, "This should help." Welcome to the weird, squelchy world of animal-based medieval medicine, where the best cures weren't always in your garden, but rather somewhere between the stable and the crypt. The logic behind it, if you can call it that, goes back to sympathetic magic, the idea that like affects like. If something resembled your illness, caused your symptoms, or simply made you say "ugh" aloud, it could probably heal you. That principle was applied liberally to the animal kingdom, turning everything from frogs to foxes into unwilling physicians. In short, if it crawled, slithered, squeaked, or died convincingly, someone in the 14th century probably strapped it to their chest. Let's start with the toads. Toads were believed to have absorptive powers. Specifically, they could draw out poisoned, swelling, evil spirits, and occasionally one's dignity. The most common practice was to tie a dried toad to the neck, belly, or affected body part. Some toads were used whole, others were gutted, dried, and worn in small pouches. The closer to your skin, the better. One particularly persistent belief claimed that placing a toad on a bubonic plague bubo would cause the swelling to burst, killing the toad in the process and absorbing your illness. You'd die later anyway. But by medieval standards, that still counted as progress. Toads weren't the only ones pressed into medical service. Here's a short list of other animals that were recruited for the war on disease. Snakes. Dried snake skin was worn as a necklace to prevent fevers or cure epilepsy. Snake flesh was eaten to treat leprosy, despite having absolutely no impact on the immune system and significant impact on one's ability to enjoy food. Fox lungs. Dried and powdered, they were prescribed for asthma and chronic cough, under the belief that foxes were clever and elusive, and therefore their lungs could help yours escape illness. Sheep dung. Applied warm to the body for boils, bruises, and even broken bones, because apparently no one thought to ask the sheep how well that worked. Beaver testicles. Dried and made into powders or oils, believed to improve male virility and reduce inflammation. This is also the source of castoreum, used in perfumes, and horrifyingly, food flavouring centuries later. Duck grease. Used for joint pain, sore throats, and making patients too slippery to catch by death itself. In some monasteries and apothecaries, animal hearts and livers were dried and powdered into tonics. One notable recipe for melancholy of the soul included ground deer antler, ox gall, fermented pigeon droppings, a sprinkle of saffron, for taste presumably. It didn't cure sadness, but it did distract the patient with existential nausea. Let's not forget the live animals. Sometimes the creatures weren't just dried and applied, they were actively involved in the healing process. Live mice. Split open and applied warm to warts or abscesses. Occasionally baked in pies for asthma sufferers. It was not dessert. Frogs. Hung upside down by the legs to cure nosebleeds, based on the idea that draining the frog's blood would somehow rebalance yours. Hedgehogs. Roasted and eaten to treat urinary blockages. Their spines were boiled into stiffness tonics, used for arthritis and bad posture. Yes, medieval Europe had a cure for your bad back made from boiled hedgehog. In rural areas and folk medicine traditions, it was common to see animal amulets used as preventative measures. Examples include badger paws tied to cribs to ward off illness, weasel teeth for teething infants. Oh, the irony. Mole feet worn around the neck to prevent scrofula. Toadstones, actually fossilised fish teeth, believed to detect poison when dropped in a cup of wine. None of these worked. All of them were considered deeply reassuring. Why this obsession with animal parts? It wasn't entirely irrational, not by medieval standards. People lived in close contact with animals. They observed nature constantly. And in the absence of microscopes, antibiotics, or Netflix, they made associative leaps based on whatever was lying around. The world felt alive, spiritually, emotionally, and alchemically. If your joints hurt, maybe you needed something limber, like the sinew of a fox. If you had chills, maybe you needed the warmth of a goat, by literally wearing one. If a toad could survive in filth, maybe it could absorb yours. Unfortunately, this led to some truly gruesome concoctions. A few examples preserved in medieval medical texts. Powdered stag antler plus pigeon blood plus wine equals potion for bladder stones. Dried lizard mixed with honey equals cure for epilepsy. Boiled puppy fat equals treatment for sore limbs and general regret. Burnt swallows plus vinegar equals skin infection salve. There were even recipes for unicorn horn powder, which was usually made of a narwhal tusk and sold at catastrophic prices. It didn't work either, but it made you feel fancy while dying. So here you are, wearing a toad around your neck with dried snake skin in your boot, and a warm ferret perched on your stomach to regulate digestion. Your breath smells like hedgehog. Your physician smells like fox lungs. And someone's heating up a duck just in case your cough comes back. Is it helping? Absolutely not. But at least your neighbours think you're protected by powerful squishy magic. Your body is a battlefield. You've been purged, lanced, leech-kissed and blessed by 3 different saints. There are herbs in places you didn't know you had, and something is still very, very wrong. Your humours remain unbalanced. Your complexion is troubled. Your bowels, according to your chart, are heretical. The royal physician enters. He wears robes embroidered with zodiac symbols. He smells faintly of vinegar and goat, and he carries a scroll that has nothing on it but confident scribbles. And then he does what medieval physicians did best. He makes an extremely educated guess. This is the golden core of medieval high-status medicine. When in doubt, wrap it in Latin and hope the patient dies slowly. You see, royal physicians, the ones who served kings, dukes, bishops, and extremely wealthy cheese merchants, weren't exactly known for getting their hands dirty. That was barber surgeon work. Real physicians were academic men, trained at universities like Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna. They wore long robes, carried ornate flasks, and had an unshakable belief in books written 1,000 years before antibiotics. Their job wasn't to cure, their job was to theorize. The core theory remained humoral medicine: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, each tied to the 4 elements, the 4 seasons, the 4 temperaments, and the 4 most popular excuses for vomiting in public. The physician's job was to determine which humour had gone rogue, and whether it needed cooling, heating, moistening, or drying. And the tools of the trade? A urine flask for colour analysis. Yellow meant bile, red meant fever, black meant someone used wine again. A pulsing wrist to examine, usually while pretending to listen to the patient's complaint. And a book of case studies, preferably one in Latin with no illustrations to flip through while nodding sagely. Here's how a diagnosis might go. The patient says, "My chest burns, I cough blood, and I can't breathe." The physician says, "Clearly the phlegmatic humours are in rebellion due to an excess of cold and moist properties, colliding with the fiery element of Mars in ascendant retrograde." Translation: sounds like pneumonia, but I'm going to say it louder and in Latin so I sound smarter than your lungs. Royal physicians especially had one priority: never ever admit ignorance. To do so could mean losing your stipend, being replaced by a new quack with shinier robes, or worse, having your patient die and being blamed for it without the dignity of a scapegoat goat. So instead, they got creative. Symptoms were explained through long metaphysical analogies, like the liver has grown melancholic due to the imbalance of moistures in the lower quadrant of Saturn's influence. If the patient improved, success. If the patient worsened, blame the stars, the patient's temperament, or a misalignment of cosmic vapours. Sometimes the guessing was so bold it bordered on surreal. Take, for instance, the royal use of diagnosis by astrology, wherein the doctor would delay treatment because the moon was in Aries, which governed the head, and it would be rude to operate on your head while the moon was watching. Or the theory of internal fermentation, which suggested that fevers were caused by bile boiling in the stomach, like a spoiled stew. The cure? Usually to vomit more. There were even debates over whether dreams were reliable sources of medical information. Nightmares were sometimes interpreted as signs of spleen dysfunction. So if you dreamed of drowning in cabbage, and who hasn't, you might get bled and sent to confession. And when real diseases began to surge, say, the Black Death, these physicians produced treatises, not treatments. Rather than visiting the infected, many wrote lengthy explanations involving miasma, planetary misalignment, or earthquakes disturbing the balance of air and fire. Very few mentioned rats, because rats weren't in Galen. To be fair, some of these guesses were sincere. Physicians wanted to help. They just lacked the tools, the knowledge, and the understanding of germs, immune systems, or basic hygiene. And they were working within a tradition that prized book learning above all. In fact, many physicians were discouraged from experimentation. The texts of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna were considered sacred. To contradict them was to question the foundation of medicine itself. So they guessed. But they guessed with elegance. A favourite trick among these physicians was the use of obfuscation. They would diagnose with phrases like morbus humoralis in excessu bilis, translation, you're too spicy inside, vapores ascendentes ex ventriculo, translation, your stomach vapours are rising again, clerica passio cum melancholia complicata, translation, I don't know, but it sounds cool. These phrases sounded authoritative, were nearly impossible to dispute, and helped mask the fact that they had no earthly idea what was actually happening inside you. And what happened when multiple physicians disagreed? An academic brawl. Each would present their own theory, citing different planetary alignments, urine colours, or dream interpretations. The noble patient, usually confused and increasingly damp, would then choose the one who looked most confident, or had the better beard. Physicians were rarely punished for failure, but they were occasionally replaced by alchemists, herbalists, or literally a goose, if the goose had a reputation. Because at the end of the day, treatment was less about results, and more about ritual, and so here you are, laid out in a silken bed, surrounded by glowing flasks of urine, your physician muttering about the moon's influence on your spleen. He hasn't touched you in days, but he has adjusted your diet, banned red foods, hung rosemary from the rafters, and declared your pulse ambitiously erratic. You're not sure what that means. He's not sure either. But he says it like he studied it in Bologna in the rain. You've endured so much, and yet the fever still lingers. And so now, they say it must be the air. Not the inner air, not your lungs, but the air around you. The very air you breathe, thick, mysterious, unseen, and deeply offensive to your 14th century doctor's nose, which is why he is now lighting things on fire. Welcome to the war on miasma, the medieval theory that disease spread through bad smells. To be clear, they didn't know about germs, viruses, or bacteria, but they did know that sick people stink, and places filled with illness usually reeked of filth, sweat, and despair. And from that, they drew a grand conclusion. If it smells bad, it must be diseased. If it smells good, it must be healthy. So your sick room is about to become an olfactory battleground. Part church incense, part chimney fire, and part medieval gas chamber. Let's begin with the classics. Incense. Burned in homes, churches, and hospitals, incense was believed to purify the air, calm the spirits, and drive out illness, especially if it was sweet-smelling. Common materials included frankincense and myrrh, used since antiquity symbolically and medicinally, juniper berries, tossed into flames to drive out plague, rose petals, sage, and lavender, burned for their cheering properties, sulphur, for when you needed the air to smell worse before it got better. Monks carried censers, swinging clouds of perfume across the dying. Towns burned herbs in public squares. Wealthy households had fumigation rooms, where sick patients were essentially smoked like sausages in the name of hygiene. But sometimes perfume wasn't enough, so they turned to smoke bombs of desperation. Recipes varied but might include vinegar-soaked rags, burning old shoes, yes, really, dried animal dung, bundles of tar-soaked straw, the occasional burning hairball, either from livestock or unlucky barbershop sweepings. Why hair? Because hair burned poorly, released acrid smoke, and made everyone regret everything. Which, in the logic of medieval medicine, meant it must be working. If your doctor was especially ambitious, he might combine aromas into a scent strategy. For example, hang herbs near the bed, rosemary for cheer, thyme for bravery, rue for protection. Place spiced pomanders near the nose, small balls filled with cloves, cinnamon, ambergris, and wax. Boil vinegar and onions on the hearth. And if things were truly dire, release a loud fart and blame it on the humours. No, seriously. Flatulence was occasionally seen as a natural purge, a healthy release of internal gas that could rebalance the humours and repel infection. Some healers even encouraged patients to air themselves out while chanting psalms. It didn't work, but it did clear the room. But wait, there's more. During outbreaks of plague or bad air, entire cities took action. They lit barrels of pitch and resin in public streets, burned aromatic woods, like cedar and sandalwood, mandated the use of nosegays, tiny herb bouquets, for anyone entering the marketplace, walked in processions waving burning torches to cleanse the heavens. Hospitals and monasteries had dedicated smoke rituals, where every patient's room was filled with layers of scent, some holy, some herbal, some possibly just whatever hadn't gone mouldy in the cupboard. And of course, no story of medieval scent-based medicine would be complete without the plague doctor's beak. The iconic beaked masks weren't just creepy fashion. The nose cone was packed with dried flowers, crushed herbs, vinegar sponges, camphor crystals, and occasionally things like rosemary, mint, garlic, or opium. The idea was to filter the bad air, protect the wearer from miasma, and offer a mildly distracting aroma while trudging past hundreds of dying patients. It didn't work, but it smelled better than the alternative. Let's not forget the magical smelling cures either. A mixture of rosewater and crushed pearls applied to the forehead to calm the vapours. Burnt feathers, used to induce coughing or weeping. Essence of ambergris, yes, the waxy secretion from a whale's intestine, prized for its musky scent and alleged disease-fighting powers. And if all else failed, a good old-fashioned hair singeing might do the trick. That's right. Singeing the patient's hair, especially facial hair, was thought to open the pores, release excess heat, and prepare the body for more effective scent therapy. You'd sit by the fire, your eyebrows would sizzle, and someone would whisper, "The healing begins." Of course, none of this addressed real infection. It didn't fix wounds. It didn't kill bacteria. It just made the air harder to breathe. But it gave people a sense of control. And in an era when medicine involved a lot of waiting, hoping, and watching your neighbours die, a cloud of lavender and holy fire felt like a good start. So now, here you are, lying in bed beneath 4 layers of soot. The room smells like a beehive fell into a bonfire. Your doctor is chanting, Someone just tossed oregano on a brazier, and your eyebrows are gently smouldering. Do you feel better? Absolutely not. But you do smell like an herbed roast. And in medieval Europe, that was halfway to healed. Somehow miraculously, you're feeling better. Sort of. You're not actively oozing. You've stopped hearing the ghostly whispers of your spleen. And for the first time in weeks, no one has tried to shove anything fermented up your nose. But don't celebrate yet. Because here in 1349, surviving the treatment is only half the battle. The next half? Surviving the recovery. And spoiler, medieval Europe was not big on follow-up care. Let's start with the obvious problem. There were no post-illness recovery plans, no physical therapy, no antibiotics, no vitamins, no take two and call me in the morning. What you got was a blessing, a fresh shirt, and a piece of cheese if you were lucky. Your doctor would declare your humours stabilised, your spleen less ambitious, and then just leave, usually to check the stars, or to see another patient, or to nap under a pile of dried leeches. You meanwhile were left alone, cold, and very likely still contagious, though no one knew what that meant yet. Here's where things got tricky. Your body was no longer in full crisis mode, but you just endured weeks of bleeding, vomiting, fasting, burning, sweating, and shouting. Your immune system wasn't just weak, it was practically filing for early retirement. And in this weakened state, many people succumb to secondary infections. That scratch on your leg, the one someone smeared with mould and wrapped in goat wool, now it's festering. That cough, not fully gone, that boil, still seeping something ominously named in Latin. Many patients who survived their original diagnosis died weeks later from things like sepsis, lung infections, gangrene, or mysterious wasting diseases that were probably just severe malnutrition. Then there were the superstitions. Medieval recovery wasn't just physical, it was ritualistic. Every culture, region, and monastic order had its own set of rules about what a recovering patient should eat, avoid, wear, fear, or smell. Examples include avoiding red meat for 40 days because it was too hot and could reignite your humours. Not looking at bright colours, especially yellow or red, as they could stir the blood. Wearing wool gloves indoors to protect your spleen from moon chills. Sleeping with a wooden spoon under the tongue to ensure your dreams didn't reheat the phlegm. Not laughing too hard for a month, which frankly may have been wise considering your abdominal wounds. One wrong move and your carefully balanced recovery could unravel like a poorly woven monk's robe. And food? Ah, yes, the post-sickness diet, carefully curated by medieval wisdom, which valued blandness above all else. Thin gruel made from oats and water, weak herbal teas, ideally bitter and untrustworthy. Bits of boiled chicken, so overcooked it had to be interpreted rather than chewed. Absolutely no garlic, onions or spices, unless your physician was feeling rebellious or Italian. The idea was that strong flavours could reignite your passions, and by extension, your bile. Because nothing ruins a recovery quite like a lustful stew. Then there was rest. You were instructed to avoid sunlight, avoid cold air, avoid loud noises, avoid women, men, children, dogs, cats, swans, mirrors, and looking at the moon for too long. You were not to walk too far, sleep too deeply, laugh, cry. Think about theology for more than 5 minutes. Basically, you were told to exist in a gentle, lukewarm fog, hoping not to tip your system back into chaos. And how long did this go on? 40 days. Sometimes more, sometimes forever. 40 was the sacred number of recovery, tied to the Bible, the humours, the seasons, and how long it took your doctor to write a new astrology chart. During those 40 days, you were watched closely, not with thermometers or checkups, but with horoscopes, urine sniffing, and the occasional poke with a goose feather to see if your muscles twitched. If you made it through, congratulations, you were still considered vulnerable, and advised to wear talismans, avoid public gatherings, and carry a pomander for at least another season. Because even a light breeze could trigger your downfall. Let's not forget the psychological side. Recovery didn't just involve the body, there was an emotional toll. You'd watched others die, smelled yourself decay, been accused of being possessed, been treated with rituals more fitting for exorcism than healing. People often emerge from recovery with symptoms we'd now associate with PTSD, anxiety or depression. But in medieval terms, this was often blamed on an imbalance of black bile, melancholy, or demonic residue. You might be sent to confession, or isolation, or simply told to walk barefoot over rosemary and get on with it. And if you got sick again, which let's be honest was highly likely, given the filth, rats, unwashed hands, and your friend's generous new boil, you'd just start the whole process over. The bleeding, the fire, the fermented animal parts, the charts, the prayers, the weeping, and you'd once again have to hope that your physician's best guess was better than his worst. So here you are, alive, technically. You've survived the ordeal. You've reached the end of your 14th century medical journey. Your humours are, for now, in harmony. Your doctor is busy charging the next patient triple. Your leeches have retired to a vineyard. And you're left with a skull cap full of memories and a mysterious herbal ointment that smells suspiciously like boiled eel. But for now you sleep, because in a few days the wind will shift, someone will sneeze, a monk will whisper about an omen, and you'll be back at square one, wondering which part of your body resembles a walnut this time. If you've managed to stay awake through the nightmare that was medieval medicine, honestly, you deserve to live until at least 1350. If you liked this dive into history's most horrifying health trends, feel free to subscribe or leave a sleepy comment. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'd love to know what time it is where you're tuning in from. And now, as the room falls quiet, the fire burns low, and your physician slips away to check the moon's spleen, you can finally stop pretending the leeches helped. Sleep well, and may all your humour stay deliciously, miraculously balanced.